I rented a cabin deep in the northern woods of Montana, somewhere between the middle of nowhere and the edge of civilization. I had found it online through a small site run by locals. It wasn't listed on Airbnb or any big platform. The ad just said, "Private cabin, no neighbors, near creek, great for writing or resting. No Wi-Fi, no distractions." That was exactly what I needed. I had burned out at work. I had trouble sleeping. My chest always felt heavy, and I couldn't breathe properly some nights. I needed to get out. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I just wanted to be alone. It was late September. The air was starting to chill, and the leaves had just started to turn. Reds, yellows, and browns covered the road as I drove toward the cabin. I had flown into Missoula, rented an old but reliable 4x4, and followed the printed directions. I had no cell signal, no GPS. I kept checking the directions every few minutes to make sure I wasn't lost. The road narrowed until it was just gravel. Then it turned to dirt. Trees crowded in on both sides, and I saw no signs, no fences, no gates. Just woods. For miles. The cabin sat in a small clearing. It was older, built from thick logs, with a rusted tin roof and a wide porch that wrapped around one side. A metal chimney poked up out of the roof. There was an old shed off to the side, leaning slightly. The creek was maybe 50 yards behind the cabin, hidden by trees, but I could hear it. That steady sound of running water, soft and distant. Inside, the cabin smelled like pine and smoke. It was clean but worn. There was a small wood stove in the corner, a bed with a heavy quilt, a simple kitchen with old appliances, and a bathroom with a metal shower. The water was from a tank, and there was no electricity except what came from a car battery hooked to a small solar panel. It was enough to charge my flashlight and power a single light bulb above the sink. That was it. I unpacked quickly. I had brought canned food, dry goods, a cooler with ice packs, and a bunch of firewood in the back of the truck. There was already some stacked against the wall, but I didn't want to run out. I also brought a handgun I legally owned. Not because I expected trouble, but because it felt better to have it out here. There were bears, mountain lions, and maybe worse. Not people, just the unknown. The first night was calm. I lit the stove, warmed up a can of soup, and sat on the porch as the sun went down. Everything turned gold, then gray, then dark. I watched shadows move through the trees and listened to the wind and water. I heard animals now and then, rustling in the bushes, the call of an owl, the distant splash of something in the creek. It didn't scare me, it felt natural. I slept easily. The next day, I walked down to the creek. It wasn't wide, maybe 6 feet across, but it moved fast. The water was clear and cold. I followed it upstream for maybe a quarter mile, stepping over roots and fallen branches, just exploring. I didn't see any footprints or signs of other people. There were no wrappers, no paths, nothing. Just moss, rocks, water, and trees. That afternoon, I started writing. I wasn't working on anything serious, just notes, ideas, whatever came to mind. The quiet helped. I sat outside on the porch with my notebook and wrote for hours. Sometimes I looked up and just stared at the trees or at the creek through the gaps. I saw deer once, a whole group moving silently through the woods. It was peaceful, felt like healing. That night, something changed. I woke up to a sound. It was past midnight, and I had been sleeping hard. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough to pull me awake. It was a knock, not on the door. It sounded like it came from the wall. One knock, then silence. I sat up in bed, listening. I heard the creak, the wind, the groan of trees moving slightly. Then again, knock, lower, maybe closer to the ground. I got out of bed and grabbed the flashlight. I moved slowly to the window and looked out. The porch was empty. Nothing moved. I opened the door, quietly, and stepped outside. The air was cold, and my breath came out in mist. I stood barefoot on the wood planks, listening. I heard the creak again. Nothing else. Then, as I turned to go back inside, I saw something near the edge of the clearing. It was a shape, low to the ground, maybe 2 feet high. It wasn't moving. At first, I thought it was a stump, but it hadn't been there before. I had walked that edge earlier. I knew what was there. I shone the flashlight toward it, and the beam flicked across something that looked like fur. I stepped forward just one step. The shape moved suddenly, fast. It ran toward the trees, silent. I couldn't tell what it was. Maybe a raccoon, a badger, maybe something else. I stayed outside for another minute, then went back inside and locked the door. I kept the flashlight next to me in bed and didn't sleep for hours. The next morning, I checked the edge of the clearing. I didn't see any prints, but the ground was hard and covered in leaves. I found a spot where the leaves were disturbed, pushed aside in a line. Something had run through. I followed the line for a while but lost it in the undergrowth. I went back to the cabin. That day I couldn't write. I kept thinking about the sound, the shape, the feeling that something had watched me. I sat on the porch again, but I faced the trees now, not the creek. I held the handgun on my lap. I felt stupid, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I stayed up late. I didn't turn off the light. I kept the fire going and sat in a chair by the window. For hours, I saw nothing. Then, close to 3 a.m., I heard it again. Knock. Lower, heavier. Not on the wall this time. On the floor. Beneath the cabin. I stood up slowly. The cabin was built on short stilts, maybe 2 feet off the ground. There was no basement. Nothing should be under there. The knock came again. Then silence. I waited for minutes. Nothing. I opened the door again and stepped out. This time I crouched down and shone the flashlight under the cabin. Nothing moved. Just dirt, leaves, the beam of light fading into shadows. I didn't see anything, but when I stood up again, I felt something behind me. Not close, but near the tree line. I turned fast and aimed the light. There was something standing between the trees. Not crouched this time. Standing. I couldn't see it clearly, just the outline. Maybe 4 feet tall. Not a bear. Not a person. It stepped back slowly, then disappeared behind a trunk. I went back inside and locked the door again. The next day, I packed. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just loaded the truck. I left the firewood stacked. I left my notebook on the table. I was ready to leave, to drive back toward something familiar. But the truck wouldn't start. I turned the key again and again. Nothing. The battery was fine. Lights came on. But the engine didn't catch. I opened the hood. I checked the fuel line, the spark plugs. I don't know much about engines, but something wasn't right. Something looked cut. A small rubber line had been sliced. Clean. Straight. Not torn. That's when I felt it. That deep, hard fear. I was stuck. No cell signal. No way to call. Miles from anyone.
No neighbors.
Just trees. I kept the gun on me the whole day. I stayed inside. I watched every window. I locked the door. That night, I didn't sleep. Just after midnight, I heard something again. Not a knock. A scrape. Along the wall. Like claws. Then a thud. Then silence. I held the gun tight. I stayed in the corner behind the table. I didn't move. Just before dawn, I heard footsteps. Light. Slow. Around the cabin. I saw a shadow pass the window. I didn't breathe. I waited. When the sun came up, I went outside with the gun. I didn't see anything, but near the back wall, under the window, I saw prints. Small, human-shaped, bare feet, but too small for an adult. Maybe the size of a 6-year-old, but wide. Wrong shape. There were 4 toes. I ran. I didn't care about the truck. I took my pack, the gun, the flashlight. I followed the creek. I knew it would lead somewhere. Water always leads somewhere. I walked all day. I didn't stop. I heard things. Movement behind me. Snaps of branches. But I never looked back. By late afternoon, I saw a road. A ranger found me hours later, walking barefoot, covered in scratches, shaking. I didn't explain much. Just said I got lost, truck broke down. They towed the truck out a week later. I never went back for the rest of my stuff. Now, months later, I still hear things sometimes when I close my eyes. Scrapes, knocks, footsteps. But I don't live near the woods anymore. I don't camp. I don't hike. And I never go near creeks. It was early September when I decided to take a break from everything. I'd been working too much, sleeping too little, and spending most of my time indoors staring at screens. My job had been draining me slowly, and I felt like I was losing parts of myself day by day. So I booked a remote cabin in northern Minnesota for a week. It was the kind of place you only heard about from people who liked silence, fishing, and the sound of their own breathing. There was no phone signal, no internet, and no nearby neighbors. That's what I wanted. Complete silence. The drive was long and uneventful. Just highway, then two-lane roads, and finally a dirt path that twisted through thick woods for what felt like forever. I had to slow down often to avoid deep ruts and fallen branches. The sun had already dipped low by the time I reached the cabin. It looked exactly like the pictures online. Small, simple, wood-sided, and old. It stood at the edge of a dense forest with a narrow gravel driveway and a tiny porch with a bench. The place looked forgotten by time. I unlocked the door and stepped into the single-room interior. There was a wood-burning stove in the corner, a small kitchen against one wall, and a twin bed pushed under a small window. The only light inside came from a single ceiling fixture and an old floor lamp. The cabin had no running water, but there was a well outside with a hand pump. A compost toilet sat in a separate shack about 30 yards into the woods. I knew that would take some getting used to. That first night, I unpacked, made a simple dinner of canned soup, and sat on the porch listening to the night. It was dead silent. No cars, no voices, just the occasional crack of a branch or hoot of an owl. I felt my body starting to relax for the first time in months. The next morning, I woke up with the sun. The air was cold and damp. Dew clung to the windows, and the inside of the cabin smelled like old wood and dust. I stepped outside, stretched, and walked around the area. There was an old trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. I followed it for a bit, but turned back when the trees started to thicken. I wanted to take it easy the first day. I spent the day reading and chopping some firewood. The quiet was comforting, but I couldn't help feeling like I was being watched. I told myself it was just my brain adjusting to the isolation. I'd lived in the city too long. Every rustle of the leaves made me glance up. Every creak of the trees made me pause. That night, something strange happened. I was lying in bed with the oil lamp turned low when I heard footsteps outside. Very slow, deliberate footsteps. They crunched over leaves and twigs, getting closer to the cabin. My heart pounded. I reached over and turned off the lamp. The room went dark. The footsteps stopped. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I waited for what felt like an hour, but there was nothing else. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a deer, maybe a raccoon. I finally fell asleep sometime after midnight. The next morning, I checked outside. There were footprints, human footprints. They weren't mine. They came from the woods and circled the cabin once. Then they vanished back into the trees. My stomach sank. I tried to think of a reason someone would be out here, walking around my cabin at night. I couldn't come up with anything. I didn't have cell service to call anyone. No neighbors to ask for help. I didn't even have a weapon, just a dull axe I used for firewood. I told myself it was probably just a hunter or hiker who got lost. But that didn't make sense. There were no trail markers, no campsites nearby, and the cabin was clearly private. I spent the rest of the day on edge. Every sound made me jump. I didn't go back into the woods. I stayed on the porch, axe nearby, eyes scanning the tree-line. When night came, I locked the door and shoved a chair under the knob. I didn't sleep much. By the fourth day, I was exhausted. I had bags under my eyes, and my nerves were frayed. That morning, I saw something that made it worse. Hanging from a tree branch near the back of the cabin was a dead rabbit. Its body had been strung up by its hind legs, tied with some kind of string. Its throat was slit. Blood had dripped down the fur and pooled on the forest floor. I stood there, frozen. This wasn't some random predator. This was someone's doing. Someone had killed the rabbit and left it there for me to find. I pulled it down, buried it behind the cabin, and tried not to throw up. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my bag, loaded my car, and tried to drive out. But not even 5 minutes into the dirt road, I found a tree had been pushed over, blocking the path. It was too thick to move on my own, and I didn't have any tools besides the axe, which wasn't nearly enough to cut through something that thick. I was stuck. I backed up to the cabin and parked again. I couldn't believe what was happening. Someone didn't want me to leave. I considered trying to hike out, but I didn't know how far I'd have to go, and I wasn't even sure which direction to take once I left the dirt road. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed by the window, clutching the axe, staring out into the woods. Every few hours, I thought I saw movement, a shadow, a figure, but every time I blinked, it was gone. Then, around 3 a.m., I saw someone standing at the edge of the woods. They were just standing there, facing the cabin, not moving, not making a sound. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't open the door. I just sat there, gripping the axe with sweaty hands, waiting. After a while, the figure turned and walked back into the woods. In the morning, I went out to look. There were fresh prints where they had stood. Heavy, deep prints, big ones. And right by the base of the tree where the rabbit had hung, I found something new. A carving in the bark. A shape that looked like a stick figure, but with a line through the head. That day, I didn't eat. I didn't even try to relax. I just stayed alert. Every hour dragged on. Every sound kept me on edge. I started to talk to myself out loud just to hear a human voice. When night came, I decided I couldn't stay inside anymore. I dragged a chair onto the roof, climbed up, and sat there with the axe, trying to get a better view of the woods. It was quiet for most of the night. Cold too. I wrapped myself in a blanket and waited. Around 2 a.m., I saw something move behind a tree. Then I heard footsteps again. But this time they didn't stop. They got closer. I could hear breathing, low, rough breathing. Then I saw a figure walk slowly out of the woods and approach the cabin. It was a man, tall, thin, with something in his hand. I couldn't see his face. He walked up to the front door and stood there, just a few feet below me. He didn't knock. He didn't try to get in. He just stood there. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My heart was hammering in my chest. The man stood there for a long time, then walked around the cabin. I could hear him brushing against the walls, dragging something across the wood. When he came back to the front, he stared up at the roof. I froze. Then, just as slowly as he came, he turned and walked back into the trees. I stayed on the roof until morning. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink for what felt like hours. When the sun came up, I climbed down and went to check the front of the cabin. There were scratches on the door, deep ones like from a knife or something sharp. I was done. I didn't care about the fallen tree anymore. I took the axe, hiked down the dirt road, and didn't stop. I walked for almost 4 hours before I found a ranger station. I stumbled in, out of breath, dirty, shaking, and explained everything. They sent a crew to check the cabin. They found the rabbit carcass I'd buried. They saw the scratches on the door, the footprints, the carving in the tree. But there was no sign of the man. Nothing. No tent, no tools, no sign that anyone had been living nearby. They said maybe it was a drifter, someone passing through. But I knew it wasn't random. Someone had been watching that cabin, waiting for someone to come alone. I never went back. I didn't even ask for a refund. I sold my camping gear, stopped going on solo trips, and moved to an apartment with 24-hour security. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. But I know one thing for sure. He wanted me to be alone, and he almost got what he wanted. It was early October when I decided to take a break from work and spend a week alone in a remote cabin in the northern woods of Minnesota. I found the cabin listing online. It was small, off-grid, had a wood stove, no cell service, and sat near the edge of a quiet lake. It seemed perfect. The photos showed a rough wooden dock, an old canoe, and a clearing that opened up to a dense forest that stretched for miles in every direction. I booked it for 7 days and packed up my truck with food, a cooler full of ice, water, books, and everything else I thought I might need. The drive up there was peaceful. As the towns got smaller and the roads turned to gravel, I felt a kind of relief settle in. I had been feeling burned out for months. Work had been piling up, and I couldn't remember the last time I had a real break. The cabin was located about 3 hours from the nearest major town, and the last 10 miles were nothing more than a dirt trail surrounded by tall pines and dense brush. I followed the directions the owner had emailed me and eventually pulled up to a clearing where the cabin stood. It looked older than the photos showed, but solid. It was built out of dark logs with a slanted tin roof and a little porch. There were 2 chairs out front, one of them a bit broken. The inside was basic. A single bed with an old mattress, a small wooden table with 2 chairs, a narrow counter with a propane stove, and shelves with some cooking tools. A wood stove stood in the corner, and there was a stack of split firewood outside. The outhouse was about 30 yards behind the cabin, near the tree line. The first day was uneventful. I spent the afternoon cleaning the place up a little and settling in. I walked down to the lake and sat on the dock for a while. The water was still, and the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional splash of a fish. There were no boats, no cabins across the lake, no people. It felt like I was completely alone out there. That night, I lit a fire in the stove, made a simple dinner, and read for a few hours before going to bed. The second day, I explored the area more. I followed a faint trail that curved around the edge of the lake and into the woods. The trail didn't seem to be used often. In some places, fallen branches blocked the path, and I had to step over or around them. I walked for maybe an hour before turning back. I didn't bring a GPS or anything, just a basic compass and a printed map the cabin owner had left. When I got back, I noticed something strange. One of the firewood stacks looked like it had been knocked over slightly. At first, I thought maybe I did it by accident, but it looked too neat for that, like someone had moved a few pieces and then left the rest alone. I res-tacked it and brushed it off. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing things outside. Not loud, just soft thumps and rustles. Every time I got up and looked through the small window, I saw nothing. I told myself it was probably raccoons or deer. The area was full of wildlife, after all. On the third day, I decided to go fishing. There was an old tackle box and a rod in the corner of the cabin, probably left behind by another renter. I walked down to the dock, cast a few lines, and actually caught a couple of small perch. I cooked them for lunch, and they tasted better than I expected. I spent most of the day by the water, reading and enjoying the quiet. Around dusk, I noticed something else strange. On the far side of the lake, near the tree line, there was a small shape. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a black bear, but the shape didn't move. It just stayed there, low to the ground. I squinted for a while, but the light was fading. Eventually, it was too dark to see clearly, and I went inside. That night, I didn't sleep much at all. I kept hearing those same noises outside. Light footsteps, a tapping sound, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. I got up at least 3 times to check, shining my flashlight through the window, but saw nothing. Once, I thought I saw something move near the tree line, but when I stepped outside with the flashlight, the beam only lit up the fog that had started to roll in from the lake. The fourth day started off foggy and cold. I stayed inside most of the morning. Around noon, I walked out to get more firewood and stopped when I noticed fresh prints in the mud by the corner of the cabin. They weren't animal prints. They were boot prints, large, maybe a man's size 11 or 12. They went around the cabin, stopped near the window, and disappeared into the woods behind the outhouse. My stomach turned. I hadn't seen another person since I got there. I checked the door, though I always locked it at night. Nothing seemed to be missing. I spent the rest of the day nervous. I kept the axe nearby and made sure to lock the door even during the day. I didn't go far, just stayed close to the cabin. I kept looking out the windows, scanning the trees. I didn't see anything, but I felt like something was off, like I was being watched. That night, the sounds outside got louder. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a noise that sounded like someone tapping on the front door. Just a light, steady tap. I didn't move. I stayed in bed, barely breathing. The tapping continued for maybe a minute, then stopped. After a long while, I got up, slowly, and peeked through the window. There was nothing there, just darkness and fog. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. On the 5th morning, I found something else. On the edge of the dock, there were small piles of stones stacked on top of each other. 3 piles, about 5 or 6 stones each. They hadn't been there the day before. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe someone was messing with me. Maybe a local had found the cabin and was trying to scare me. Maybe it was just kids. But I hadn't seen a car, hadn't heard a boat. Nothing. That day, I packed up most of my things. I decided to leave the next morning, 2 days early. I was too anxious to enjoy myself anymore. I felt tense all the time, jumping at every sound. I even started keeping the axe next to the bed at night. That night was the worst. I had just laid down, maybe around 10 p.m., when I heard something outside. It was footsteps, slow, crunching footsteps walking around the cabin. They circled once, twice, then they stopped. I was frozen. I held the axe tightly, listening. A few minutes passed. Then the doorknob rattled. Just a quick jiggle, like someone was checking if it was locked. I didn't move. I stayed completely still. The door creaked a little, then nothing. I stayed like that for hours, axe in hand, back against the wall. The noises didn't return. At first light, I grabbed my bags, tossed everything into the truck, and got the hell out of there. I didn't clean up, didn't lock the door, didn't leave a note. I just drove. About an hour into the drive, I pulled over at a gas station to fill up and buy coffee. I walked into the bathroom to wash up and noticed something on the back of my jacket. It was a smear of mud. Not normal mud either. It looked like someone had pressed a dirty hand against my back. I still don't know what happened out there. I don't know who was in those woods or what they wanted. Maybe it was just a drifter. Maybe it was someone who lived out there. Or maybe someone knew the cabin would be empty and saw me as an easy target. I never went back to that area. I emailed the cabin owner when I got home and told them the place was unsafe, that someone was lurking around. They never replied. To this day, I double-check every lock before I go to sleep. I don't go on solo trips anymore, and I haven't set foot in a cabin since. It was the middle of September when I drove up to the cabin. The place belonged to a friend of a friend, someone I didn't even know personally. They offered to let me stay there for a week, completely alone, to unwind. I had been working back-to-back shifts at a distribution warehouse, pulling long nights and never really getting time to clear my head. I didn't care much about who owned the place. All I needed was silence, nature, and time away from people. The cabin was tucked far into the woods, several miles off the main road. It was surrounded by thick trees, mostly pine and birch, and sat next to a small lake that looked black and still under the cloudy sky. The dirt road leading to it was narrow and bumpy, barely wide enough for my car. I had to drive slow to keep from bottoming out. When I finally pulled in, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. The cabin was small, built from dark logs, with a pitched roof and one chimney. There was a small porch with an old wooden bench and a screen door that squeaked when I opened it. Inside was even smaller than it looked. One bedroom, a small bathroom, and a main room that acted as the kitchen and living space. It smelled of wood and old dust, like it hadn't been lived in for a long time. There was no internet, no TV, and no cell signal. It was exactly what I needed. I unpacked the groceries I brought with me. Canned food, instant coffee, some snacks, and bottled water. There was a small gas stove and a wood-burning heater in the corner. I found the woodpile out back and stacked some near the heater just in case the nights got cold. I spent the rest of that first evening sitting on the porch, watching the lake and listening to the sounds of the forest. No cars, no voices, no machines. Just wind through trees and the occasional splash from the lake. The first night was quiet. I slept better than I had in weeks. The second day, I hiked around the lake. There wasn't really a trail, but the terrain was easy to walk through. I took my time, enjoying the smell of pine needles and the way sunlight broke through the branches. I didn't see any signs of other people. No boats on the lake, no tire tracks, no campsites. It was like the whole place had been forgotten. That evening, I started noticing things. It was small at first. When I came back from the hike, I found the front door slightly open. I was sure I had closed it. I even remembered hearing it click shut behind me. I figured maybe it didn't latch properly. It was an old place, and the door didn't hang perfectly straight. I shut it hard and locked it, Then I noticed one of my socks missing. I had left a pair drying near the fireplace. One was there, the other gone. I checked around the floor thinking it might have fallen or blown under the couch, but it wasn't there. I assumed maybe I dropped it without realizing and didn't think much of it. That night, I heard something outside. It was after midnight. I had just gotten into bed, and the fire had gone down to glowing embers. I was drifting off when I heard what sounded like soft footsteps on the gravel outside. Not animals, not the scurrying kind of noise squirrels or raccoons make. These were slow, careful steps like someone trying not to be heard. I froze and listened. The steps stopped after a while. I stayed awake for another hour, barely breathing, just listening. Nothing else happened, so I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe a deer, maybe branches falling. The next morning, I saw the footprints. They were near the side of the cabin, close to the window by the bed. They were faint, but I could see them in the soft dirt. Human footprints, barefoot, no shoes, no boots, just dirty toes and heels pressed into the ground. I stared at them for a long time. They didn't go anywhere else. Just a few prints near the window, then nothing. I should have left then. I know that now, but I told myself it was some drifter, maybe someone from a nearby cabin, maybe a local who liked walking the woods at night. The idea of someone staring in through my window while I slept made my skin crawl, but I didn't want to overreact. I kept telling myself it was nothing. That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the fire going, made coffee, and tried to read one of the old paperbacks I found on the shelf. I checked the windows every hour. Nothing. No more footprints. No movement in the woods. That night, it rained. I fell asleep to the sound of water hitting the roof. It should have made me feel safer. No one would be out walking barefoot in the rain. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound that made my stomach drop. A soft tapping. Not at the door, at the window. I didn't move. I just stared at the ceiling. The tapping came again. Slow, spaced out like a fingertip knocking against the glass. Then silence. I eventually sat up, heart pounding. The room was pitch black. I couldn't see anything out the window, just the reflection of the inside of the cabin. I waited until sunrise before I moved. When it got light enough, I opened the front door and stepped outside. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soaked. Mud clung to my boots as I walked around the cabin. I found the window where the tapping came from. There were no marks on the glass, but just below it, in the mud, were more footprints. Barefoot, smaller this time. There were more of them now. A trail of prints going around the cabin, circling it. Some went up to the porch, some to the back door. Then they just stopped, like whoever made them had vanished. I packed my things. I threw everything into my bag without organizing it. I didn't care. I didn't eat breakfast. I just wanted to leave. I didn't even take the food from the pantry. I grabbed my keys and opened the front door. My car was gone. I stared at the empty patch of dirt where I parked. At first I thought maybe I parked it farther down the trail and was misremembering, but I wasn't. I parked right in front of the porch. Now it was gone. No tire tracks, no signs of it being dragged. Just gone. I ran back inside and locked the door. My hands were shaking. My mouth was dry. I grabbed the small hatchet from the fireplace and held it tight. That entire day, I sat in the cabin, waiting. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner with the hatchet, watching the windows. The next morning, I checked again. The car was still gone. No footprints this time. Nothing. Just quiet, heavy air and wet leaves sticking to the porch. I considered walking out, but the nearest town was miles away and I wasn't even sure which direction it was. I didn't have a map, and I didn't want to risk getting lost. I told myself I'd wait one more night. Maybe someone would come. Maybe a ranger or a hiker or someone. That evening, I heard movement in the woods. It started as snapping twigs, then rustling leaves, then what sounded like breathing. Slow, heavy breathing just beyond the tree line. I didn't look. I stayed still. The sound moved around the cabin, slow and steady. Then it stopped. The footsteps came back that night. Around midnight, I heard them approach the cabin, soft and careful, then tapping again. On every window, one by one, like they were checking each one. Then silence. I must have passed out at some point from exhaustion. When I woke up, the sun was just rising. My head hurt. My mouth was dry. I looked out the window. There was food on the porch. A can of beans, a bottle of water, and my missing sock. I didn't move. I just stared at it. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't want to know. I waited another full day. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just waited. That night, no one came. The next morning, I opened the front door. My car was back. It was parked exactly where I left it, covered in dew, keys in the ignition, everything untouched. I didn't question it. I threw my bag in the back seat and left. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 2 hours away. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't report it. I didn't ask the friend who gave me the cabin if anyone else used it. I just went home, locked my doors, and didn't go outside for a week. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but it was human, real. Not a ghost, not a monster. Someone who watched me sleep. Someone who walked around barefoot in the woods at night. Someone who took my car and brought it back. Someone who left food on my porch like they thought I needed it. I don't go into the woods anymore. Not alone. Not ever again. I had been working nonstop for almost a year. The job, the city noise, the endless emails, they had all worn me down. I needed a break. Not just a weekend getaway, but a proper escape where I could be alone, cut off from everyone and everything. So, I rented a cabin deep in the northern woods of Michigan. It wasn't one of those cute little Airbnb places with Wi-Fi and heating. This one was isolated. No internet, no cell signal, no neighbors for miles. Just trees, dirt roads, and a single wooden cabin that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The guy who handed me the keys didn't say much. He pointed out the directions on an old paper map and reminded me to bring enough food, water, and supplies because the nearest town was about an hour and a half away, and that was if I didn't get lost. I filled the back of my SUV with everything I thought I would need for 2 weeks alone. Non-perishable food, jugs of water, sleeping gear, a couple of books, a flashlight, and a battery-powered radio. I brought my axe and a hunting knife too, just in case. I wasn't planning on going full survivalist, but it felt right to be prepared. The drive took nearly 7 hours. As I left the main highways behind and drove onto narrow dirt roads, I realized how quiet everything was. No cars, no people, just trees closing in around me. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked even older in person. Wooden walls with moss growing between the cracks, a metal roof that was rusting at the edges, and a porch that creaked loudly under my weight. But it stood solid. I carried my gear inside and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. The interior was basic. One main room with a fireplace, a wooden table, a small kitchenette with an old gas stove, and a separate room in the back with a cot and a mattress that smelled like dust and mold. The windows were small and had no curtains. I unpacked my supplies, started a fire, and boiled some water for coffee. I felt strangely content, even though the silence was a little too thick. That first night, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the wind in the trees. Felt peaceful. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds. It was cold, colder than I expected, but manageable. I went outside, chopped some wood, and walked around the clearing. There was a narrow trail leading into the woods, but I didn't feel like exploring yet. I spent most of the day reading and settling in. That night, as I lay on the cot, I thought about how nice it was to be away from everything. I hadn't even touched my phone. On the third day, I decided to hike the trail. I wore my boots, packed water, and brought the hunting knife. The trail wound deep into the forest, with tall trees crowding the sky and blocking most of the sunlight. After about an hour, I reached a small creek. I sat there for a while, enjoying the quiet. On the way back, I thought I heard something in the trees. A crunch of leaves, a snap of a branch, but I didn't see anything. Probably just a deer, That night, I noticed something odd. When I stepped outside to use the bathroom, I saw boot prints in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. They were fresh. My boots had a different tread, and I knew for a fact I hadn't walked that way. I stared at them for a long time. They led from the woods to the side of the cabin and then back again. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I went back inside, locked the door, and pushed a chair against it. The next morning, I circled the cabin looking for more tracks. I found 2 more sets leading toward the back of the cabin, but they disappeared into the trees. I kept telling myself it could be a hunter, or maybe a local who knew about the place. But the guy I rented it from said no one lived nearby. I didn't know what to do. I had no way to call anyone. I turned on the radio, but it was just static. I kept the hunting knife on me the rest of the day. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing creaks and thumps outside. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe animals, but it didn't sound like that. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch. I sat up in bed and listened, my heart pounding. The sound stopped. I waited for hours, gripping the knife, staring at the door. When morning finally came, I stepped outside slowly. Nothing looked disturbed, but I found more prints, this time closer to the windows. Someone had been watching me. I felt sick. I wanted to leave, but I knew the drive back would take hours. I wasn't sure if I should stay or go. I made up my mind. I would pack up the next morning and leave. One more night. That evening, I built up the fire, secured the windows with whatever I could find. Wooden boards, old nails, even chairs. I put heavy things in front of the doors. I didn't eat much. I was too anxious. I sat with my back to the wall, holding the knife, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. Then a knock. Not a loud bang, just a light tap, like someone testing if I would respond. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The knock came again, then silence. I waited for what felt like hours. No more knocks, no sounds. I stayed awake until morning. At sunrise, I grabbed my stuff, threw everything into the SUV, and didn't look back. The dirt road felt longer on the way out. Every time I saw movement in the trees, I flinched. Took me hours to reach the town. I went straight to a gas station and asked if there had been any reports of people trespassing near the cabins. The guy at the counter just shook his head. I returned the keys to the cabin owner. He barely looked at me, just took the keys and said, "Hope it was peaceful." I nodded and left. I never told him what happened. I didn't tell anyone, but I haven't gone back to the woods since. I still don't know who was out there. Maybe it was just some drifter, maybe someone curious about the cabin. But they watched me. They walked right up to the windows, and they never said a word. That's what stays with me. The silence, the quiet knock in the middle of nowhere. I escaped, but sometimes, when it's late and I'm alone, I remember that sound, the knock, and I wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door. It was early October when I decided to take a break from work and head out into the woods for a week. I'd been feeling burnt out, and the idea of spending some time alone in a remote cabin sounded like exactly what I needed. I found a small place listed on an old camping forum. It wasn't on any mainstream rental site, just a few pictures and an email address. The owner told me it was up in the northern part of the state, surrounded by forest, no cell signal, and about a 30-minute drive from the closest gas station. That sounded perfect to me. The drive out there was long, and the last stretch of road turned into gravel, then dirt, and then just tire tracks through packed earth. My little sedan barely made it through the narrow path. Branches scraped the sides of the car, and a few times I had to get out to move fallen limbs off the trail. I didn't see another car or person for over an hour once I got off the main road. I started to second guess if the place was even real, but just when I was about to turn back, the cabin came into view. It was small, maybe 20 feet across and a little longer than that. The wood was old but well maintained. There was a small porch, a chimney, and a rusted metal water pump next to the steps. It looked like something out of a movie, but not in a magical or fantasy way, just old and forgotten. There was no lock on the front door, just a heavy latch that you could bolt from the inside. I pushed it open, and the wooden boards creaked under my feet. Inside, there was a cot, a small table, a chair, a cast iron stove, and a few shelves with old canned goods and dusty cooking supplies. There were oil lamps instead of electric lights. I had brought a portable battery bank and a solar charger, but I wanted to rely on those as little as possible. I wanted to feel like I was living off the grid. I unpacked some food, bottled water, a hunting knife, my camping gear, and a small hatchet. I also brought a small propane heater just in case the nights got too cold. The first night was calm. I made myself a simple meal of canned soup, warmed up over the small stove. It took a while to get a fire going inside, but once it was crackling, the place warmed up fast. I listened to the quiet sounds of the forest through the slightly cracked window. There were no cars, no voices, just the wind, some branches rustling, and the occasional owl hoot. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I slept surprisingly well, even with the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the cabin settling. The second day, I hiked a bit around the area. I found an overgrown trail behind the cabin and followed it for a while. The forest felt untouched. No signs of trash or other hikers. It was just thick woods, uneven terrain, and the sound of my own footsteps. I came across a small stream and filled my filter bottle. The water was ice cold. When I got back, I noticed something small that didn't seem right. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd closed it. Not latched, but at least pushed shut. Maybe the wind did it. I looked around but didn't see any tracks. Nothing to suggest someone else had been there. Still, I checked inside to make sure everything was how I left it. Nothing was missing. I wrote it off and let it go. That night, I kept the latch bolted. I sat on the porch with a headlamp on, drinking tea and listening to the woods again. I thought I heard something heavy move through the brush about 100 feet out. It wasn't fast or panicked like a deer, more like something walking slowly, but I didn't see anything. I stood there for a while, headlamp pointed into the darkness, before finally going back inside and locking up. On the third day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I read a book I'd brought, chopped a bit of firewood from the old pile behind the cabin, and cleaned up some of the mess inside. I found old rat droppings in a few corners and swept those up. When I was outside getting water from the pump, I noticed a faint footprint in the dirt near the back corner of the cabin. It was almost gone, like it had rained or something had smudged it. It wasn't mine. I'd been wearing boots with deep treads. This one looked smoother, almost like a worn-out sneaker. I looked around again. Nothing. The trees were silent. The sky was overcast and flat. I started to feel uneasy. That night, I didn't go out on the porch. I stayed inside, kept the fire going, and made sure the latch was bolted. I kept the knife nearby while I slept. I woke up in the middle of the night to a dull thud. Came from the front of the cabin. My heart was pounding. I didn't move at first. I just lay there listening. Then I heard it again. A single soft knock. Not at the door, but maybe on the wall or the porch post. Then nothing. I stayed awake for an hour, knife clutched tight, eyes scanning the dark room. Eventually, I fell back asleep, and in the morning, I checked the porch. Nothing seemed out of place. But when I walked around to the back of the cabin, I saw it. Another footprint. This one was fresher, more defined. And next to it, a handprint on the wall. Faint, but definitely there. Someone had touched the back of the cabin during the night. I packed my stuff, ready to leave, but my car wouldn't start. I turned the key and nothing happened. Battery was dead. I popped the hood and checked the terminals. One of the cables was loose. Too loose, like someone had unscrewed it. I tightened it and tried again. It started. I should have left then, but I didn't. I told myself maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe it was animals. Maybe the footprint wasn't what I thought it was. I stayed one more night. That night, I built a fire in the pit outside before it got dark. I sat there with my headlamp, facing the woods. I felt like something was out there. I couldn't hear anything, but the silence was too thick. Around midnight, I heard it again. A soft sound, like someone exhaling or shifting their weight on the forest floor. I killed the lamp and sat in the dark, listening. Then I saw it, a silhouette standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. I stood up, heart racing, and walked slowly to the cabin, never turning my back. I went inside, bolted the latch, and waited. I heard footsteps around the cabin. Slow, deliberate, not running, not sneaking, just walking. I stayed up all night, waiting for something to happen. But it didn't. The footsteps eventually stopped, but I didn't sleep. In the morning, I packed everything into the car and drove out without breakfast. I didn't look back. When I got to the gas station, I told the clerk there was someone messing around near the cabin. He just looked at me and said it was private land for miles, no one lived out there. I never went back. I looked up the listing again weeks later. The post was gone. Email didn't work anymore. I still think about that last night, about the shape in the trees, the prints around the cabin, the loose battery cable. Nothing ever happened, not really. No attack, no fight. But something was out there, watching me, waiting, and I'll never know what it wanted. I never really liked being alone in the woods, but when you grow up around people who enjoy silence and nature more than anything else, you get used to it. My cousin owned a small cabin up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, tucked between thick pine trees near a quiet lake that most tourists didn't know about. It was about a 4-hour drive from where I lived, and for years, we went up there together during hunting season or just to escape the noise of the city. But this time, I went alone. It was late September, just cool enough that you needed a jacket in the evenings, but not cold enough to turn on the heat during the day. My cousin had moved out of state for work, and the cabin hadn't been used in almost a year. He said it needed a little cleaning up, but it was still in good shape. I figured I could use the time alone to clear my head. Work had been rough. I had just come out of a long relationship. I was tired of people. I wanted trees and wind and quiet. I packed my truck with everything I thought I would need. Food, extra clothes, a generator, gas, a rifle just in case, and a couple of books. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, nothing but miles of forest and the soft lap of water against the rocky shore. When I got there, the cabin looked the same. The paint had chipped a little, and a few branches had fallen onto the roof, but nothing major. I opened the windows, let in some fresh air, swept out the dust and cobwebs, and by sunset, I was sitting on the small wooden deck out front, watching the lake turn dark and glassy. That first night was uneventful. I heard coyotes in the distance and a few rustling sounds near the edge of the trees, probably raccoons or deer. I slept well. The bed was still surprisingly comfortable, though it creaked whenever I turned over. The second day, I hiked around the lake. The woods were thick, and the underbrush was damp from rain a few days before. My boots got muddy fast. I walked for a couple of hours, not following any trail, just exploring. I saw a few squirrels, a woodpecker, and some deer tracks. I didn't see a single person. That was the point. I liked that. By the third day, things started to feel strange. Not terrifying or anything, just off. I woke up to the sound of my truck's door slamming. I thought maybe a branch had fallen or the wind had picked up, but when I looked outside, everything was still. I went to check anyway. The driver's side door was open. I always lock my vehicle, especially when I'm out in the woods. Nothing seemed stolen. I checked the back seat and under the truck, even looked around the trees, but I didn't see anyone. That afternoon, I set up a few small motion lights around the front and back of the cabin, just battery-powered ones. I had used them before on other trips. They weren't fancy, but they worked. I also moved my truck so the driver's side faced the cabin window. That way, if I heard anything again, I could just look out. That night, I read for a while and then went to bed. Around midnight, one of the motion lights clicked on. It was the one near the back of the cabin by the small shed. My body tensed up. I stayed quiet, listening. I didn't hear footsteps or movement, just the faint hum of the wind. I turned on the outside light and looked out the window. I couldn't see anything. The light blinked off again after a few seconds. I stayed awake for another hour, staring at the ceiling, not sure if I should be worried or not. By the fourth day, the woods felt different. I don't know how else to describe it. It wasn't just that something had set off the light. It was like the silence had changed. Usually, you hear birds, squirrels, wind in the leaves, but it was too quiet. I sat on the deck with a cup of coffee, and the stillness made my skin crawl. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. I spent most of that day near the cabin. I chopped some wood, cleaned the shed, made sure the locks were all working. I even set up a couple of small tripwire alarms using string and empty cans, just in case. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon. Maybe the batteries in the light were low. Maybe I forgot to lock the truck. But deep down, I didn't believe any of that. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up because I heard the faintest sound. It was like gravel being stepped on. I laid still, holding my breath. Then I heard it again, closer this time, like someone walking just outside the cabin. My heart started pounding. I reached for the rifle beside my bed, carefully got up, and peeked through the curtain. There was nothing there, just the faint glow from the moon and the still trees. I moved to the other window, the one facing the shed. That's when I saw it. The door to the shed was wide open. I had locked it earlier that day. It wasn't a strong lock, but it was something. I stared at the shed for a long time. I didn't see anyone. Finally, I decided to stay inside. I kept the rifle close and didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked the shed. The lock was on the ground. It had been cut clean through. Not broken, not worn out, cut. Someone had used bolt cutters or something similar. Inside, nothing was missing, but a few things had been moved. A box of tools was sitting on the floor, opened. A small hatchet was no longer hanging on the wall. I knew then that someone had been there. I wasn't alone. I packed some of my stuff back into the truck, but I didn't leave. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe some kid had found the cabin. Maybe it was someone passing through. I should have left, but I didn't. I stayed one more night. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to feel like I had been scared off. Maybe I wanted to catch whoever it was. That night, I stayed up. I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, watching the front and back windows. Around 3 a.m., I saw a shape moving near the trees. Just a shadow at first, then a figure. A man. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, and he moved slowly. He walked straight toward the shed, looked around, then went to the side of the cabin. My heart was racing. I could barely breathe. I raised the rifle, but I didn't want to shoot. Not unless I had to. The man stood at the side of the cabin for a long time. Then he turned and walked back into the woods. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I packed everything, threw it into the truck, and drove out fast. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I called the local sheriff when I got home, gave them the location, told them what happened. They said they'd send someone out to check, but I never heard anything back. My cousin eventually sold the cabin. I never went back. I still think about that man sometimes, standing there in the dark, just watching. There was nothing supernatural about it.
No ghosts, no creatures.
Just a person, a real person, out there in the woods watching a cabin that hadn't been used in almost a year. And the scariest part is not knowing what he wanted, or how long he had been watching before I noticed. I haven't been back to the woods since. I keep the lights on at night now. I double-check the locks. And sometimes, when I wake up and hear a sound outside, I think about that cabin. I remember the quiet, the shed door swinging open, the man by the trees. And I wonder how close he got to the cabin before I ever saw him. It started with a simple idea. I wanted to get away for a while, away from everything. My job was eating me alive, the city was too loud, and I was barely sleeping. I needed to disappear for a few days. No emails, no neighbors, no traffic. Just me and some trees. I found this old cabin online. It was listed by some private owner on a small forum for off-grid rentals. No major booking website, no fancy photos, just a few shots of the cabin surrounded by thick trees and a paragraph that said it had power, water, and a fireplace. It was in Montana, a good 6-hour drive from where I lived. That made it perfect. The drive there was long, but peaceful. I took my time. The roads got smaller and more narrow the closer I got. By the time I reached the last 30 miles, I was on gravel. No cell signal, nothing on the radio, just the sound of tires over rock and the occasional bird flying by. When I got there, I could already feel the tension in my chest start to fade. The cabin was tucked away on the edge of a thick patch of pine trees, with a small clearing in front of it. There was a creek maybe 100 feet off to the right. The air smelled like pine needles and earth. The cabin was old but sturdy, made from logs that had darkened over the years. There were 2 windows in the front, a small porch, and a red door that stuck a bit when I opened it. Inside, it was simple. A main room with a fireplace, a table, a small kitchen area with a stove and sink, and a narrow hallway that led to a bedroom and bathroom. It smelled like wood and dust, like nobody had been there in months, maybe longer. There were a few shelves with books, old hunting magazines, and a map of the nearby woods pinned to the wall. I unpacked right away, just a duffel bag of clothes, some dry food, and a few things to keep me occupied. I had brought a journal, some novels, and my hunting knife just in case. No guns. I didn't plan to hunt anything. I just liked having the knife on me in unfamiliar places. That first night, I lit a fire in the fireplace. It took a while to get going, but once it caught, the warmth filled the room quickly. I sat on the old couch with a blanket and listened to the sounds outside. I heard the wind, the occasional creak of wood from the cabin settling, and once, the howl of a coyote far off in the distance. It was the kind of silence that you forget exists when you live in the city. I fell asleep quickly that night. No screens, no noise, just a full stomach and warmth from the fire. But I woke up sometime after midnight. It was pitch black. The fire had burned down to embers. I didn't hear anything at first, just silence. Then I heard what sounded like crunching outside, like someone walking on gravel. I sat up and waited. Nothing. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. In the morning, I walked around the property. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I noticed some faint tracks near the edge of the clearing. They looked human, barefoot, but it was hard to tell. Could have been old. I tried not to dwell on it. The woods play tricks on your mind. I'd read that before. The second day was calm. I read most of the morning, cooked some food, and explored the creek. There were no trails, no signs of other people, just trees and more trees. That night, I made another fire and tried to enjoy the quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone. I woke up again around 1 a.m. This time, it wasn't noise that woke me. It was a feeling. I was cold. The fire was completely out. I got up to throw more logs in and noticed the front door was cracked open. I was sure I had locked it. I always lock doors, especially in strange places. I shut the door and locked it again. Then I walked around the cabin with my flashlight. Everything looked fine. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry. I figured maybe I didn't close it properly earlier. Maybe the wind pushed it open. Still, it bothered me. That morning, I checked the door again. No damage. I decided to stay close to the cabin that day. I didn't want to wander too far. I kept my knife on me all day. I didn't even read. I just sat on the porch, watched the woods, and listened. It was too quiet. Even the birds weren't singing much. Later that day, I found something strange. About 30 yards behind the cabin, I noticed some disturbed dirt, like someone had dug something up. It wasn't a big hole, maybe the size of a basketball. It was shallow, but in the middle of it was an old can, the kind you store ammo or tools in. I opened it. Inside were some scraps of paper, a pocket knife, and an old photograph of a man standing next to the same cabin. The back of the photo said, October 1991, don't trust the woods. That didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just the warning. It was the feeling I got when I held that photo, like someone had left it there for a reason. I reburied the can and went back inside. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up with the knife in my lap and the fire burning. I didn't hear anything until around 3 a.m. I thought I heard something brushing against the outside wall. Slow, dragging sounds. Then nothing. I waited, holding my breath. After 10 minutes, I got up and looked through the front window. There was nothing. But the next morning, I found marks on the porch, like someone had dragged something heavy across it. The railing had fresh scratches. I was ready to leave, I packed up most of my things that morning, but my car wouldn't start. I turned the key and it clicked, but the engine didn't turn over. The battery was fine. I had checked it before the trip. I popped the hood and looked around, but I didn't see anything obvious. The wires were all in place. It was like something just wasn't connecting. I tried again and again until the key stopped clicking entirely. Now I was stuck. I went back inside and decided to wait it out. Maybe it was just a freak problem. Maybe I could try again tomorrow. I kept the knife close and stayed inside the whole day. That night, I locked every door and window and moved the couch in front of the door. But around midnight, I heard footsteps again. This time they were closer, louder. I sat by the fire, barely breathing. The steps stopped right outside the door. I didn't move. Then I heard the door handle turn. Once, twice, then it stopped. After a long pause, I heard retreating footsteps, but they didn't go far. I stayed there the rest of the night, staring at the door. In the morning, I opened it slowly. The clearing looked the same, but on the porch, I found something that hadn't been there before. A small pile of rocks, stacked like a tower, right in front of the door. I knocked it over and threw the rocks into the trees. That day, I made the decision to walk. I packed a bag with water, food, my knife, and a flare gun I had brought just in case. I left a note on the table with the date and time and headed east, toward the road I came in on. It was a long hike, maybe 20 miles, but I had no choice. After 6 hours of walking, I made it to the gravel road. I was exhausted and sore, but relieved. I followed the road for another few miles before I saw a car. It was a forest ranger doing patrol. I flagged him down and explained I had car trouble. He gave me a ride to the nearest station. I didn't tell him everything, just that my car wouldn't start and I needed a tow. He radioed someone to go get it. The next day, I called the tow company. They said they found my car, but the engine was wrecked. Someone had cut the wires under the hood clean through. Not chewed, cut. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't report anything to the police either. What would I even say? That someone was messing with me in the woods? That I found a strange photo from the 90s? I don't know who was out there. Maybe someone lives off-grid and didn't like me being close. Maybe someone found out about the listing and used it to scare off visitors. Or maybe someone never left those woods. All I know is, when I look back at that photo I took the first day, the one of the cabin with the trees in the background, I swear there's a shape in the woods I didn't see when I took it. A figure, standing perfectly still, watching. I still have that photo, and every time I look at it, I feel that same cold I felt the night the door was open. I had booked a remote cabin up in the northern woods of Minnesota. It was supposed to be a week off-grid. No phone, no internet, just me and the trees. I needed it. I'd been working too many hours in the city, staring at screens, answering emails, and going to bed way too late. My body was tired. My brain felt like static. I wanted silence. I wanted air that smelled like pine and soil. I didn't want to see or hear anyone for days. The place I found online wasn't fancy. It was a small wooden cabin about 6 miles from the nearest dirt road, reachable only by hiking through a series of unmarked forest trails. The ad said it had no power, no plumbing, but there was a small wood stove, a cot, and a spring nearby for water. It sounded perfect. I packed light, a backpack, some canned food, a flashlight with extra batteries, a knife, matches, a camp stove, water filter, sleeping bag, and a journal. I brought 2 books and a map of the area. I also printed the directions to the cabin, just in case. I left my car at the trailhead around noon. It was cloudy, but calm. I followed the directions carefully, counting landmarks just like the instructions said. A downed birch tree, a rock shaped like a boot, a narrow stream. It took almost 2 hours of walking through thick forest, sometimes pushing through overgrown brush, before I finally saw the outline of the cabin through the trees. It looked older than I expected. The wooden planks were gray with age, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle, but it felt solid. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, there was a cot with a thin mattress, a small table with 2 chairs, and the black iron stove in the corner. The place smelled like dry wood and dirt. There was dust on everything and spiderwebs in the corners. But it was quiet, and that's what I wanted. I spent the first day cleaning. I swept the floor with a bundled branch I found outside. I used a rag to wipe the table and cleared out a few small mouse droppings. I set up my gear in the corner, arranged my food on a shelf, filled my water bottles from the spring using the filter, and chopped some wood to feed the stove later. I sat outside on a stump until the sun went down. Then I went inside, lit a few candles, ate cold beans from a can, wrote in my journal, and went to sleep. The first night was fine. I woke up early the next day around sunrise. The forest was cool and damp. I made instant coffee on the camp stove outside and watched steam rise from the mug. It was perfect. I hiked around a bit, just exploring. There was a small hill nearby with a clearing at the top. From there, I could see the tops of the trees stretching forever. No buildings, no roads, no people. It was exactly what I needed. That evening, it rained. Not hard, just a light, steady drizzle that soaked the ground and made the woods smell stronger. I stayed inside most of the night, writing and reading. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It was probably an animal. A few light steps through the wet leaves, a soft scraping near the wall. I held still and listened, stopped after a while. I told myself it was a raccoon or deer. I wasn't scared, just aware. The forest was full of life. The next morning, I found the edge of a footprint near the front step. It was hard to tell. The rain had muddied everything, and it could have been from me the day before, but it seemed fresh. I let it go. On the third day, I noticed something was missing. My knife, which I kept beside the sleeping bag, was gone. I searched everywhere. Under the cot, on the shelf, outside by the stump. Nothing. I checked my backpack 3 times. It wasn't there. I told myself I must have left it outside and maybe an animal carried it off. But something about that didn't sit right. It was a fixed blade, heavy, with a rubber grip. Not the kind of thing a raccoon could drag away. That night, I locked the door. It didn't have a real lock, just a wooden bar I slid into place. I also stacked some firewood against the door, just enough that I'd hear it fall if someone pushed it open. I kept the flashlight near me and one of the chair legs beside the cot. I couldn't explain it, but I felt watched. I didn't sleep well. Every time the wind shifted, I'd jerk awake. At one point, I thought I heard breathing outside the wall. Slow, steady, human breathing. But I couldn't be sure. I stayed still until it stopped. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. About 10 feet behind it, I found something that made my chest go cold. A cigarette butt. It was fresh. The filter was dry, not soaked from the rain 2 nights ago. Someone had been there recently, and I knew it wasn't me. I hadn't smoked in years. I packed my things. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I packed anyway. I decided to hike out the next morning. It would take too long to make it out before dark if I left right then. I didn't want to get lost in the woods at night. That day, I kept my backpack on me at all times. Even inside, I didn't explore, didn't write, didn't eat much. I sat by the window and listened. Nothing happened until after dark. It started with the sound of branches snapping. Not the normal kind of cracks from wind or falling limbs, but steady steps. Someone was walking through the trees. I moved to the floor, turned off the flashlight, and listened. The steps circled the cabin. Slow, careful. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Closer to the wall, then back. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited. Then it stopped. Hours passed. I must have fallen asleep sometime after that, because I woke up just before dawn. I waited until the sun was fully up before I opened the door. The woods were silent, but when I turned the corner behind the cabin, I saw something that made me want to run full speed back to the trail. A boot print, clear in the mud, larger than mine with a deep tread. Someone had walked right up to the back of the cabin. I felt sick. I didn't wait any longer. I hoisted my backpack and started down the path. I walked fast, faster than I should have with a pack on. My heart was racing. I kept checking over my shoulder. The trail twisted through thick woods, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was behind me. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't eat. I just moved. I passed the stream, the rock that looked like a boot, the fallen birch. I was close, maybe 20 minutes from my car. Then I saw the shirt. It was draped over a branch near the trail. A flannel shirt, dirty and wet. It wasn't mine. I didn't touch it. I just kept walking. 10 minutes later, I reached the trailhead. My car was gone. I froze. The dirt lot was empty. I walked in circles, thinking I had made a wrong turn. But it was the right place. Same clearing, same trees, just no car. For a second, I thought maybe it was stolen. But I had taken the keys with me. No one should have been able to move it. I stood there, trying to think, trying to breathe. Then I heard the sound of an engine. Far off, faint, a low rumble behind the trees. I couldn't tell what direction it came from. Then it stopped. I ran. I didn't know where I was running to, just away from that sound. I left the trail, cutting through thick underbrush, branches whipping at my arms. I ran until my legs gave out. Then I crouched behind a fallen log and listened. Nothing. No voices. No engine. Just the wind in the trees. I stayed hidden for maybe an hour. Then I started moving again, this time staying off the trail. I used the sun to head generally south, hoping I'd find a road or a cabin. Anything. I walked for hours, slipping in mud, scraping my shins on rocks, jumping at every sound. By late afternoon, I stumbled onto a fire road, a wide gravel path used by rangers and logging trucks. I followed it. 2 miles later, I saw a ranger truck parked beside the road. I stepped out of the trees, waving my arms. The ranger was a middle-aged guy, looked confused when he saw me. I told him everything. He nodded slowly, asked me to get in the truck, and drove me to the nearest station. The police were called. I filed a report, gave them coordinates, landmarks, everything. They went out the next day, found the cabin, said there were signs someone had been living near it, a makeshift shelter hidden in the trees, cigarette butts, food wrappers, even a few old tools, but no person and no car. My car was found a week later, parked on a logging road about 15 miles from where I left it. It was locked, no fingerprints, nothing missing. They never found the man. I didn't go back to the woods after that. I sold my gear, moved to a smaller apartment with big windows and neighbors on all sides. I still wake up some nights thinking I hear breathing outside the wall. But when I check, there's never anything there. It was mid-October when I decided to take a break from everything. I had been working nonstop for almost 2 years straight, and the burnout had finally caught up with me. So I found a remote cabin up north in the forests of Michigan, far from city noise and people. It was a small, one-story place with no internet, no TV, and spotty cell service. That was the main reason I picked it. I needed peace and quiet. I needed space to think. The cabin sat at the edge of a large stretch of forest, with a narrow gravel road that barely fit my truck. I arrived just before sunset on a Thursday. The air smelled like pine, and the trees were already shedding their leaves. I unpacked, brought my things inside, and lit a fire in the wood-burning stove. It was cold, but not freezing. The place felt old but well-kept, like someone used it just enough to keep it from falling apart. The first day was uneventful. I made myself some canned soup, read a book, and went to bed early. I left the windows open slightly for fresh air, but I kept the doors locked. It was quiet, so quiet I could hear every creak of the wood, every gust of wind brushing through the branches. Took me a while to fall asleep. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to pee. I got up, used the bathroom, and was walking back to the bed when I noticed the back door. It was unlocked. I clearly remembered locking it when I arrived. I always double-check doors, especially when I'm alone in the woods. I stood there staring at the door for a good minute before locking it again. I told myself maybe I forgot. Maybe I thought I locked it but didn't. It was late. I was tired. Mistakes happen. The next morning I went for a walk. There was a trail behind the cabin that looped through the forest and came back around. Took me about an hour. On the way back, I noticed something strange. A boot print. Just one. It was fresh and deep, like someone heavy had stepped there not too long ago. It wasn't mine. Mine had a completely different soul pattern. I looked around, didn't see anyone, and figured it could have been left from days before. Maybe a hunter or hiker. I spent the rest of the day chopping some wood, writing in my notebook, and cooking. It got dark fast. I lit some candles since the place didn't have much electricity. There was a gas generator, but I didn't want to use it unless I had to. Around 8 p.m., it was pitch black outside. I couldn't see anything beyond the porch. I locked all the doors again, double-checked them this time. Later that night, I was lying in bed reading when I heard a sound. A soft knock, just one, came from the back door. I froze. My first thought was that I imagined it. But then it came again. One single knock, then silence. My chest tightened. I got up slowly, turned off the lamp, and moved to the hallway where I could peek toward the kitchen. The door had a small square window at the top, and through it, I saw nothing. Total darkness. I didn't go to the door. I didn't say anything. I waited for what felt like an hour. No more knocks. No footsteps. Nothing. I ended up falling asleep on the couch in the living room, fully clothed, a knife by my side. The next morning, I checked the area behind the cabin. There were no footprints, no signs that someone had been there. I told myself it was the wind, maybe a branch hitting the door. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, I moved a heavy chair in front of the door, just in case. On the fourth day, I decided to leave the trail and explore deeper into the woods. I needed to clear my head. I brought a flashlight, a water bottle, and a small pack. I walked for miles. The trees got thicker, the light dimmer. Eventually, I found a clearing, and in the middle of it was something strange. A bunch of small animal bones arranged in a pattern. It didn't look natural. They were placed carefully, forming a circle. I didn't step any closer. I turned back and walked quickly to the cabin. The rest of the day I stayed inside, curtains drawn, not even making a fire. I kept a kitchen knife with me even in the bathroom. I knew something was wrong. I could feel it. That night, just after midnight, the power went out. Not that I was using much of it, but the fridge stopped humming, and the little light in the hallway blinked off. I lit some candles, sat in the living room, and listened. The woods were completely silent. Then I heard it. The sound of leaves crunching. Slow footsteps. Not animals. Too steady. Someone was walking near the cabin. I blew out the candles and stood completely still. The footsteps circled the cabin. Then they stopped near the front porch. I waited, barely breathing. Then the doorknob rattled. Just once. Someone was checking if it was unlocked. I backed away into the kitchen, grabbed my flashlight, and waited. The rattling stopped. Minutes passed. I stayed frozen in place. Eventually, I heard footsteps walking away. I didn't sleep at all. At sunrise, I packed everything, tossed it in my truck, and drove off without even eating. I made it back to the nearest gas station an hour later, heart still pounding. I told the clerk someone was snooping around the woods near my rental. He just shrugged, said it's common out there. Lot of weird folks in the woods. A week later, I checked online and found a local forum talking about break-ins and strange encounters near the area where I stayed. No arrests, just stories. People hearing noises, seeing strangers near their property, things going missing. Some said it was a group living deep in the woods, off the grid, watching cabins. I never went back. I deleted the listing from my favorites and burned the notebook I took with me. The whole trip was supposed to help me reset. But all it did was teach me that when you're deep in the woods, completely alone, you're never really alone. Someone could be watching, waiting, and sometimes they don't want to be seen. I still think about that boot print. The knock, the bones in the woods. They weren't random. Someone was out there, and they knew I was alone. I was 34 years old when I took a week off work to clear my head. I had been living in a busy city for years, stuck in a loop that felt like it never ended. Wake up, go to work, come home, sleep, repeat. I worked in IT, staring at screens all day, dealing with angry people who had forgotten passwords or spilled coffee on their laptops. I lived alone, had no pets, no girlfriend, and most of my friends had either moved away or grown distant. I just needed to be away from everything for a while. I found a small rental cabin online. It was near a decommissioned logging road in northern Washington, about 4 hours from where I lived. The pictures showed a wooden structure tucked in a forest clearing with a fire pit and a tiny porch. The description said it had running water from a well, a small solar panel for lights, and a wood stove for heat. It also said it was peaceful, remote, and a great escape from modern life. That's exactly what I was looking for. I booked it for 5 nights. The owner sent me detailed directions, saying GPS wouldn't work that far out. He also mentioned that the last stretch of the road might be muddy if it had rained recently. It had rained a bit the week before, but it seemed to be clearing up. I figured my SUV could handle it. I packed clothes, food, some books, a portable battery pack, a flashlight, a camping knife, and a hatchet. I also brought a sleeping bag just in case the cabin bed was bad. I left early Monday morning and drove north through winding mountain roads, passing fewer and fewer cars the deeper I got into the forest. After the last town, it was just forest, silence, and the occasional logging truck going the other way. The last 10 miles were slow. The road turned to gravel, then dirt, and it got narrower as I climbed higher into the hills. Branches scraped my side mirrors. Potholes made the whole car bounce. After about 40 minutes of rough driving, I found the spot where I was supposed to turn left off the main dirt road. There was a barely visible wooden sign with an arrow carved into it, and behind it was a narrow track leading into thicker trees. I followed it slowly, branches brushing the sides of the SUV. After maybe half a mile, the trees opened up into a small clearing. There it was, the cabin. It looked just like the photos, small, made of rough logs, with a crooked chimney and a roof that sagged just a bit in the middle. There was a fire pit surrounded by stones, a stack of firewood, and a few old plastic chairs. It looked old but not abandoned, just rustic. I parked off to the side and got out. The air was fresh and cool. I didn't hear anything but the wind in the trees and some birds in the distance. No traffic, no people, just nature. I unlocked the door with the key left in a combination box, went inside, and looked around. It was basic. A table, 2 chairs, a counter with a propane stove, and a sink that worked when I pumped the handle a few times. A bed with a lumpy mattress. A shelf with a few books and a lantern. A small solar panel inverter with 2 outlets. There was a wood stove in the corner with a metal bin full of chopped logs next to it. I lit the stove to take the edge off the cold. It filled the place with dry heat and a comforting smell of smoke. I unpacked and spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was thick and quiet. No trails, just moss-covered logs and ferns everywhere. I found the old logging road nearby, mostly overgrown and muddy. It looked like no trucks had been on it in years. That night, I sat by the fire pit, ate canned chili, and watched the stars. It was peaceful. I slept well that first night. The second day started quiet. I read most of the morning, chopped some firewood just for something to do, and made instant coffee on the propane stove. Around midday, I walked farther down the logging road, past where I'd stopped the day before. It curved down into a gully, then rose up again into a ridge. As I climbed the ridge, I noticed some strange things. First, there were tire tracks, old ones, but not that old. They weren't from a logging truck, they were smaller, like from a pickup or an SUV. They weren't deep, maybe a few weeks old at most. Then I found a cigarette, but near a rock. It wasn't wet or dirty, looked fresh. Someone had been out here recently. That struck me as odd. The cabin owner said nobody else rented it this week, and this place wasn't exactly easy to find. I figured maybe a hunter or hiker had come through, though I didn't hear or see anyone else. Back at the cabin that night, I felt a little on edge. It was quiet, too quiet. I kept looking out the windows even though there was nothing to see, just black trees and stars. I kept the fire going and made sure the door was locked. Around 11 p.m., I finally went to bed, but it took me a while to fall asleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. I didn't know why. No loud sound, no dream, just a weird feeling. I sat up and listened. first, nothing, just the fire crackling in the stove. Then I heard something outside. Not an animal. It sounded like footsteps on gravel. Slow, heavy ones, like boots. They stopped, then started again, closer. Then silence. I sat in bed, not breathing. My heart was pounding. I reached for the flashlight but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to make any noise. I waited. Then I heard the soft crunch of leaves, like someone moving around the side of the cabin. I got out of bed slowly, stepped over to the window, and peeked through the side. Nothing, just dark trees and faint moonlight. I stared for a long time, eyes trying to adjust. Still nothing. After a while, I thought maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was a raccoon or a deer. I forced myself to go back to bed, but I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I walked around the cabin looking for tracks. I found them, boot prints, fresh, not mine. They were wide and deep, like someone big had been walking around. They circled the cabin, stopped at the front steps, then went off toward the logging road. My stomach dropped. Someone had definitely been there. I thought about leaving. I really did, but it was a 2-hour drive just to get back to a paved road, and I had no cell signal to call anyone. I told myself maybe it was the owner checking on the place, or maybe some hiker got lost. I kept the hatchet close by and tried to shake it off. That night, I locked the door again and wedged a chair under the knob. I didn't light the stove so the smoke wouldn't give away that I was inside. I lay in bed, fully dressed, just listening. Around 3 a.m., it happened again. This time, it was louder. I heard someone step onto the porch. The wood creaked under their weight. Then I heard them try the doorknob. Once, then again, then harder. It rattled. I held my breath, gripping the hatchet. The chair held the door shut. Whoever it was stood there for a while. I couldn't see them through the window, they stayed out of view. After a few minutes, they walked away, but slowly. I heard them move around the side again. Then silence. I stayed frozen for hours. I didn't even blink. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed my things. I threw everything into the SUV, heart racing the whole time. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to be gone. But when I turned the key, the engine didn't start. Clicked, then nothing. I tried again. Same thing. I opened the hood, checked the battery cables. They looked fine. No animals had chewed anything. I tried again. Nothing. I sat in the driver's seat, panicking. I was stuck, miles from any help, no signal, no people. And someone out there was messing with me. I thought about trying to hike back, but it would take all day, and I didn't know if whoever was out there would be waiting. I went back into the cabin, locked the door, and pushed the table and chairs in front of it. I stayed inside the whole day, barely eating. I didn't even read. I just sat and waited, listening to every sound. At one point, I thought I heard a car engine far away, but it faded fast. That night was the worst. It started just after dark. I heard the vehicle first. A truck, or maybe an old SUV, somewhere down the logging road. The engine got closer, then stopped. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark. Then I heard footsteps, more than one set. They came up the path, circled the cabin again. I didn't dare look. Then someone knocked. Once, then again, then harder. The knocking turned to pounding. Then they kicked the door, over and over. The chair and table held, but the whole cabin shook. I grabbed the hatchet and stood in the corner, ready to fight if I had to. Then it stopped. I heard someone laughing, low, quiet, then footsteps, then silence again. I didn't sleep. I stood all night in the corner with the hatchet in my hand, waiting for them to come back. They never did. When the sun came up, I opened the door slowly. Nobody was around. I checked the road. No tire tracks. Nothing. I went to the SUV and tried the engine one last time. It started. I didn't stop to think. I threw everything into the back and drove as fast as I could down the logging road, bouncing over holes, scraping past branches, not even. I had been needing a break from everything for months. Work, people, traffic, city noise. It all piled up until I felt like I was going to snap. So when a friend at work mentioned he had a cabin deep in the Appalachian foothills that I could use for a few days, I jumped at the offer. It was supposed to be simple, quiet place. No neighbors, no cell signal, and no distractions. The drive out was long. I left before sunrise and didn't arrive until mid-afternoon. As I turned off the highway onto a gravel road that led into the hills, the signs of civilization started disappearing. By the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin, the trees were thicker, the road was rougher, and the silence outside was almost unnerving. The cabin sat alone in a clearing, tucked between dense woods and a ridge that sloped upward behind it. It was small, just one floor with a wraparound porch and an old shed off to the side, but solidly built. The paint was faded, the wood cracked in places, but it looked like it had stood through plenty of winters. I parked beside it and stepped out. There wasn't a single sound.
No birds, no breeze.
Just still air and the crunch of gravel under my boots. Inside, it was what you'd expect. A wood-burning stove, an old couch, a small table, a kitchenette with a rusted sink. There was a bedroom with a thin mattress on a wooden frame and a bathroom with cold running water but no hot. The place smelled faintly of dust and pine, but it felt safe. I unpacked what little I brought. Mostly canned food, a flashlight, matches, a good knife, a sleeping bag, and a few changes of clothes, and made myself a small meal. That first night was uneventful. I sat on the porch for a while, watching the light drain from the sky, then read a paperback novel I brought until I couldn't keep my eyes open. The only odd thing I noticed was a path behind the cabin, narrow and half overgrown, that led up the ridge. It looked like no one had used it in years. I figured it had been a hunting trail, maybe an old service path. I didn't think much of it. The second day, I explored a bit. I followed the gravel road on foot for a couple miles just to get a feel for the area. Saw a few deer, some squirrels, even a fox that darted across the road. I didn't see another house, another car. Nothing. When I got back, I chopped a bit of wood that was stacked under the shed awning and started a fire inside the stove. The cold crept in fast after the sun dipped. That night, something woke me up. It was around 2 a.m. I checked my watch. There was no electricity in the cabin, just battery lanterns. So I used the one beside my bed and turned it on. The light spilled across the wooden walls. I couldn't hear anything, not at first, but I felt something. That strange pressure in the air, like someone had just left the room. I stood up, walked to the window. Everything outside was pitch black. My flashlight beam only reached the trees near the edge of the clearing. I didn't see anything moving. Then, just as I was about to crawl back into bed, I heard a faint crunch from behind the cabin. Dry leaves underfoot. It wasn't an animal. I've lived near woods before. I know the sounds animals make. Raccoons rustling through leaves, deer stepping carefully through brush. This was heavier. A slow, deliberate step. I didn't go outside. I just stood there, frozen, listening. Whatever it was, it didn't come closer. After a few minutes, the sound stopped completely. I stayed awake for hours, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the lantern. By morning, I convinced myself it must have been a deer. A big one, maybe, but doubt lingered in my mind. That day, I hiked up the ridge trail. It started directly behind the cabin and wound up steeply between trees. It was rougher than I thought, with loose dirt and rocks, and in some parts it was barely visible. About halfway up, I found an old fence post, rotted and broken, with rusted wire trailing from it like veins. Beyond it, there was something else. About 20 yards off the trail, hidden between thick trees, I found a makeshift shelter. Not recent, but not ancient either. It was a tarp, sun-bleached and sagging, nailed between 3 trees. Under it, there were rusted cans, some empty water bottles, a dirty blanket, and what looked like the remains of a campfire. I didn't see any signs that someone had used it in the past few days, but something about it bothered me. I snapped a photo of it with my phone, though I had no signal. The rest of the hike didn't lead to anything interesting, just more trees, more silence. But when I came back down, I realized something that made my skin crawl. There were boot prints in the trail coming down. Fresh ones, deep in the dirt, bigger than mine, but they hadn't been there when I went up. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lantern on and sat by the window with my knife in my lap. I never saw anything, but I felt watched. On the fourth morning, I found something near the porch steps. A piece of string, about 6 inches long, frayed, with one end tied in a knot, just sitting there clean and dry. I didn't touch it. I looked around the cabin, walked the clearing, scanned the woods. Nothing. I put the string inside, then checked the shed. The lock was untouched. Inside was just old tools, a wheelbarrow, and some buckets. Nothing had been disturbed, but I kept feeling like someone had been nearby while I slept. That evening, I sat on the porch again. The sky turned orange. The woods turned black. I tried to calm myself, told myself it was just the stress of being alone, off-grid. Maybe I was reading too much into little things. But then I noticed something else. Way up on the ridge, past the trail, on the edge of a small outcrop of rocks, I saw a shape, just for a second, like a person standing still, watching the cabin. I stood up quickly, heart racing. But by the time I lifted the binoculars I brought, the figure was gone. I scanned the whole ridge. Nothing. That night, I nailed the door shut from the inside, used what I found in the shed. I even pushed the couch in front of it. I didn't sleep at all. Every noise made me flinch. At one point, I thought I heard breathing outside the bedroom window, but when I turned on the lantern and looked, I saw nothing. I didn't go outside. I didn't even go near the door. When the sun finally came up, I made my decision. I packed up everything I brought, loaded the car, and got ready to leave. I checked the cabin once more, grabbed my trash bag, and walked it behind the shed where the old burn barrel was. That's when I saw it. On the side of the shed, scratched into the wood, were 4 words. Stay out of ridge. It hadn't been there before. They weren't carved with a knife. They looked like they were scratched with something crude, maybe a nail or rock. The letters were uneven, deep, and raw. My heart dropped. I dropped the trash bag and backed away from the shed slowly, eyes scanning the woods. I left within minutes. As I drove down the gravel road, every shadow between the trees made me tense up. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I didn't tell anyone about it. Not for a long time. Not until I saw the news article almost a year later. It was buried deep in a local website in a section about state patrol reports. A hiker had gone missing near the same ridge. Park rangers found signs of an old campsite, a trail camera that had been smashed, and strange symbols carved into nearby trees. They never found the hiker. The article mentioned that the ridge had once been used by a group of people who lived off-grid. Not recent squatters, but decades ago, during the 70s and early 80s. Some kind of isolationist group that didn't like visitors. Law enforcement had forced them out years ago after reports of trespassers being threatened. But apparently not all of them left. Some moved even deeper into the woods. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I stayed another night, or if I walked further up the ridge, or if I ignored the signs, the footprints, the figure, the warning on the shed. But I didn't. I got out, and I never went back. It started with a simple idea. I needed time alone. No phone, no internet, no people. Just me, a few notebooks, and the quiet. I found a small cabin listed online that seemed perfect. It was buried in a remote patch of forest somewhere in northern Washington, at the end of a gravel road that barely showed up on maps. The listing said it had no electricity, no running water, and no cell service. That was exactly what I was looking for. The drive out was long and boring. The last half hour was nothing but trees, hills, and sharp turns. The road narrowed into something barely wide enough for my car, and the gravel cracked beneath my tires. I passed no other cars, no homes, no signs of life. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked even more isolated than I expected. A small wooden structure with a green roof, a short porch out front, and thick woods stretching out on all sides. There was a fire pit in the back, a rusty water pump off to the side, and not much else. I unpacked slowly. Just a backpack with clothes, a cooler with some food, a few candles, and my notebooks. The inside of the cabin was simple. One room with a small bed, a table, a couple chairs, and a wood stove. There were a few shelves on the wall with dusty plates and chipped mugs. Everything smelled like old pine and burnt firewood. The first day passed quietly. I walked around the woods near the cabin, getting familiar with the area. The forest was thick, with tall fir trees and patches of ferns. There was a small trail leading down to a creek about a 10-minute walk from the cabin. I sat by the water for a while, writing a few things in my notebook. It was peaceful. That night, I lit a couple candles and sat at the table writing. The silence was deep. No cars, no buzzing phones, not even the hum of a refrigerator. Just the faint sounds of crickets and the wind through the trees. I fell asleep early, wrapped in thick blankets as the temperature dropped. On the second day, I woke up to fog. It rolled in through the trees like smoke, thick and slow. I could barely see more than a few feet outside. The woods looked completely different, almost like I had woken up somewhere else. I stayed close to the cabin that day, chopping a bit of wood and boiling water from the pump. Sometime in the late afternoon, I thought I heard something, not an animal or the wind. It was more like a soft crunch, like footsteps on dead leaves. I stood still on the porch, listening, but there was nothing, just the fog moving through the trees. I shook it off and went inside. That night, I had trouble sleeping. There were strange sounds, faint cracks and soft rustling, like something brushing against the cabin walls. A couple of times, I sat up in bed, holding my breath. Could have been animals, maybe a deer walking by or a raccoon nosing around, but something about it felt off. The sounds were too deliberate, like something was circling. On the third morning, I stepped out onto the porch and froze. There were prints in the dirt, not boot prints, bare feet, human. They started at the edge of the trees and came right up to the cabin. Then they stopped. No prints leading away, just a straight line from the woods to the porch. I stood there staring for a long time. The prints were small, like they belonged to someone young, but the toes were long, the arches high. The skin must have been cold or wet because the prints had smudged edges, like whoever made them had stood still for a while. I felt my chest tighten. I scanned the trees, but I saw nothing. I walked around the cabin slowly, but there was no one there. I waited for a while before I could bring myself to go back inside. I tried to focus on writing, but I couldn't. My eyes kept flicking toward the windows. That night, I barricaded the door with one of the chairs. It didn't feel like enough. I kept a fire going in the stove and stayed up late, listening. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again. Slow, heavy, not like a deer, not even trying to be quiet. They came from the woods, stopped near the cabin, then moved again. I held my breath and sat perfectly still. The sounds circled the cabin once, then stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sun came up, I walked the perimeter. There were new prints. This time they were heavier, deeper, and there were more of them, still barefoot. At least 2 sets, maybe 3. They wandered around the cabin in odd patterns. At one point, they went toward the water pump, then looped around to the back door. But again, none of them led away, like whoever made them had vanished. I decided to leave. I packed up quickly and threw everything back in the car. I didn't even eat. When I turned the key, nothing happened. I tried again. The engine clicked but didn't turn over. I checked the hood, though I knew nothing about cars. I didn't see anything wrong. I tried again and again. Still nothing. I was stuck. I sat in the car for a long time, not knowing what to do. There was no signal, no nearby houses. I thought about walking back to the main road, but it was miles away through thick woods and twisting roads. I didn't know the way well enough. It would take hours. I stayed put. That afternoon, I heard something crash in the woods. Not close, but loud, like a tree branch snapping. Then silence. I waited on the porch with a piece of firewood in my hands. Every few minutes, I thought I heard faint rustling, like something moving just out of sight. That night was the worst. The sounds started early, just after dark. Footsteps again, but faster this time. Running, then scratching at the walls. Came from every side, like something testing the structure. I didn't dare light a candle. I sat in the dark with my back against the stove, gripping the firewood like a weapon. There was a thump near the back door. Then another. It was trying to get in. Then silence. Long, drawn-out silence. I waited for hours. I must have passed out at some point because I woke up at dawn, cold and stiff. The door was still blocked. Nothing had broken in. But when I stepped outside, the woods felt wrong. Too quiet. No birds, no wind. Just stillness. There were more prints. This time they led away. Into the trees. All of them, like whoever had been out there had finally left. Or were leading me. I didn't follow. That whole day I stayed inside. I barely ate. I didn't write. I just waited. I started making a plan. I'd walk out at first light the next day. Pack light, take food and water, and follow the road back the way I came. That night, nothing happened.
No sounds, no prints.
I barely slept again, but nothing came. At sunrise, I left. The walk was long. At first, I kept looking behind me. Then I picked up the pace. My legs hurt. My shoulders ached from the backpack. But I didn't stop. It took me most of the day to reach the main road. Eventually, a truck passed by, and I flagged it down. The driver gave me a strange look but drove me into town. I never went back for the car. A few days later, I called a tow service and told them the location. They found the car, untouched. The guy said the engine started on the first try. Nothing wrong with it. Not a scratch. I didn't argue. I never told anyone the full story. Just said I got spooked by animals or maybe some drifters. But I know what I saw. I know those prints weren't animals. They were human, and they kept coming back night after night. Whoever or whatever was out there had been watching me from the start. The cabin was taken off the listing site a week later. When I tried to find the address again, it didn't show up on maps. Not even satellite view. I don't care. I'm never going back. I needed to get away for a while. My head had been a mess for months. I was burnt out from work, and things weren't great at home either. So I rented a small cabin deep in the forest, about a 5-hour drive from where I lived. I found it listed on a small property rental site. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find advertised all over the internet. The photos looked plain. No decorations, no fancy setup. Just a wooden cabin tucked somewhere in the woods in northern Oregon. The idea was to stay for 8 nights. No phone service, no neighbors, no distractions. I brought groceries for over a week, a bunch of batteries, a lantern, 2 flashlights, a first aid kit, and a knife I kept under my truck seat. I didn't plan on doing anything dangerous. I just wanted peace and quiet. That's all. The road leading to the place was rough. My tires crunched over uneven gravel for nearly 30 minutes after turning off the last stretch of pavement. Trees thickened on both sides, crowding in like walls. The sky disappeared behind a web of green and gray. The first time I saw the cabin, it looked even smaller than I imagined. No porch, no railing, just a plain door, 1 window in the front, and a woodpile beside it under a thin plastic sheet. Inside, it was basic. 1 small bed, a table with 2 chairs, a stove that ran on propane, a wood-burning heater in the corner, and a tiny bathroom with an old water tank system that needed refilling every few days. No TV, no radio, no Wi-Fi, just what I wanted. The first day was peaceful. I chopped some kindling, stacked it near the heater, unpacked my stuff, and made a small dinner. Canned beans, eggs, and toast on the cast iron pan. I lit a lantern and sat on the bed reading one of the 3 books I brought. That night, rain started tapping on the roof. Kept going for hours, but I slept fine. Maybe better than I had in months. The second day was mostly the same. Rain came and went, and I stayed inside reading, writing in a notebook, and drinking tea. At one point in the late afternoon, I took a short walk behind the cabin. There was a small hill that sloped down into a gully. The trees were thick but walkable, and I wanted to get my legs moving. I didn't go far, maybe 10 minutes down and back. But I remember thinking how quiet everything was. Too quiet. No wind. No birds.
No bugs.
Just stillness. I told myself it was just the time of year or the weather, but it stuck in my head anyway. On the 3rd day, things started to feel off. I went out around noon to refill the water tank. There was a pump station about 50 yards from the cabin, just a manual hand pump over a cement basin that drained downhill. I'd fill a couple of 5-gallon containers and lug them back to the cabin, one at a time. While I was pumping, I noticed a boot print in the mud. It wasn't mine. Mine had a deep tread with a square heel. This one was smoother, worn down, and larger than mine. The toe area was flatter, maybe steel-toed. At first, I thought maybe it was left by someone who used the cabin before me. But this one looked fresh. The rain had stopped during the night, and the mud was still soft. This print had clear edges, like someone had stepped there not long ago. I looked around. Nothing. Just trees and bushes and the narrow trail between the cabin and the pump. I carried the water back, trying not to think too much about it. But that night, I barely slept. Every creak in the cabin made me sit up. The trees rubbed against each other outside, and the wind made little sounds that I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't loud, but I kept feeling like something was nearby. I got up twice to check the door lock and looked through the window with the flashlight, but I didn't see anything. On the 4th day, I walked farther down the gully behind the cabin. I wanted to clear my head, maybe prove to myself there was no one out there. I took my flashlight even though it was noon, just in case the clouds made it darker down in the trees. I followed the slope downhill until I found a fallen tree I could sit on. I stayed there for a while, maybe 20 minutes, just breathing and listening. That's when I saw movement up the ridge on the opposite side. It was fast, too fast for me to catch more than a blur. But something moved between the trees. Not a deer, too upright. I kept staring, waiting for another sign. Nothing. I told myself again it was my imagination. I'd been alone too long. Maybe the quiet was getting to me. That night, I kept the knife beside me in bed. I didn't sleep much. Around 3 in the morning, I heard a soft sound outside the cabin. It was like gravel shifting. A footstep, maybe, just one. Then nothing else. I stayed still for almost an hour, holding the knife in one hand under the blanket. I didn't turn on the lantern. I didn't want whoever might be out there to know I was awake. I didn't even breathe deep. The next morning, I went outside right after the sun came up. I walked slowly around the cabin. That's when I found something that really chilled me. Someone had placed a single piece of firewood on the steps by the door. It wasn't there the day before. It was dry and clean, not like the rest of the stack that was half-soaked from rain. I hadn't left it there. I was sure of it. It was placed neatly, like a quiet message. No footprints this time. Maybe the ground had hardened overnight. I thought about leaving that day, but I had no signal. The nearest paved road was hours away. I could drive there, but I told myself it was just some hunter passing through. Maybe they thought they were helping me out with firewood. Maybe it was nothing. The 6th night was when things got worse. It started raining again, but this time it was heavy, constant, loud enough to mask most outside noises. I kept checking the door. I even blocked it with a chair. The window had no curtains, just a thin plastic shade I could pull down. I kept thinking someone could be out there watching. I shut off the lantern early and lay in the dark. My ears strained for any sound over the rain. Then, just after midnight, there was a flash of lightning. A quick burst of white light lit the cabin through the window, and in that split second, I saw a figure standing by the trees, far back but visible. It was a man, not moving, just standing still. I didn't move either. I waited. Nothing. I didn't go near the window again. I waited until morning. When the sun finally came up, I walked to the tree line. I didn't find footprints, but I did find something worse. There was a spot where the grass was flattened, a place where someone had stood for a while, long enough to push the grass down in a clear oval shape. And beside it, tucked between 2 roots, was a cigarette butt, still dry, like it had been dropped recently, but before the rain got heavy. I don't smoke. No one else was supposed to be anywhere near this area. I packed everything up. I didn't eat. I didn't fill more water. I loaded the truck in 20 minutes and was ready to leave. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine didn't even click. Battery was dead. I checked the cables. They weren't loose. No corrosion. I popped the hood and stood there under the trees with rain dripping off the edge. I knew the battery had been fine before. I had started the truck every day just to keep it warm and make sure it was working. That morning, it was dead. I kept the knife on me and went back inside the cabin. I spent the whole day watching the window, listening, waiting. I tried to rest a few times, but I couldn't close my eyes without imagining someone coming up the steps. The flashlight batteries were running low. My food was almost gone. That night was the longest of my life. I stayed awake the entire time. I didn't light the lantern. I didn't move from the bed. I sat with the knife across my lap, eyes fixed on the window. The rain had stopped around midnight, and the silence was worse than the storm. I could hear everything. A branch cracking, an animal in the brush, something tapping lightly on the wall. Just once, just enough to freeze my blood. The morning didn't make me feel safer. I went out again to check the truck. This time, the hood was already unlatched. It had been secured the day before. That meant someone had opened it during the night. I checked the battery again. 2 of the wires had been cut. Not clean. Looked like it was done with a small blade. That's when I knew, without any doubt, that someone was messing with me on purpose. I didn't wait any longer. I packed my backpack with a few essentials, locked the cabin door behind me, and started walking the gravel road. I walked for 4 hours straight. No cars, no houses, nothing but trees. Eventually, I got far enough to catch a signal on my phone. I called for help, and a local tow truck driver came to get me. He didn't say much, just looked at me, then looked at the truck when we got back to it. He helped tow it into town, and I stayed at a small roadside motel that night. I didn't go back to the cabin. I didn't even ask for a refund. When the mechanic looked at the truck, he confirmed the wires were cut, said it was done recently and whoever did it knew what they were doing. I never got an answer for who it was or why they did it. I told the property owner through email, but they didn't. It started with a simple idea: to get away from the city, from the noise, from everything that made life feel like a grind. I'd taken a week off work for the first time in a year, and I didn't want to spend it staring at a screen or lying in my apartment doing nothing. I wanted something quiet, somewhere far. A cabin in the woods sounded perfect. I booked a small, isolated place deep in northern Michigan. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no neighbors within 5 miles. Just a dirt road leading to a small wooden cabin by a narrow, quiet lake. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon. The sky was overcast, the clouds hanging low like a ceiling, but there was no rain yet. The road there was rough and narrow. Trees leaned in from both sides, and I had to slow to a crawl more than once to avoid scraping the car. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, my tires were caked in mud. The place looked old but not abandoned. It had that worn, weathered look that comes from years of surviving harsh winters. A small wooden dock jutted out onto the lake, and there was a shed around back. Inside, the cabin had the basics: a small kitchen with a propane stove, a fridge that ran on a generator, a bed tucked in the corner with heavy blankets, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There were a few shelves with dusty books, a gas lantern on the table, and a metal box filled with matches. The windows were small and a bit dirty, but they gave a view of the woods and the lake. It felt cut off from the rest of the world, and that was exactly what I wanted. The first day passed without much happening. I unpacked, explored the edge of the lake, and took a walk along the trail behind the cabin. It wasn't marked, just a narrow path through the trees, but it looked like it had been used before. I only walked about a half mile before turning back. It was quiet out there, too quiet. I didn't hear birds or wind, just my own footsteps and the occasional crack of a twig. At night, it got cold quickly. I lit the fireplace and cooked some canned soup. The generator hummed softly outside. I tried reading one of the old books, but I kept getting distracted by small sounds. The creak of the wood, the wind brushing the trees, a faint splash from the lake. I was alone, but I didn't feel alone. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel watched, even when you knew there was no one else around. The second day, I decided to explore more. I took the trail again, this time going farther. It wound through the trees and over a small hill. At the top, I could see the lake through the trees behind me. I kept walking for another hour until I found something strange. Off the path, tucked behind a thicket of trees, was a small clearing with a fire pit made of rocks. Around it were 4 tree stumps like makeshift seats. The fire pit had old ash in it, and next to one of the stumps was a rusted tin can. It didn't look recent, but it didn't look that old either. I stood there for a while, trying to decide if it was just some old campsite or if someone else had been using it recently. I didn't see any footprints or trash, just that can and the remains of the fire. I left it alone and went back to the cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept waking up to small noises. Once, I thought I heard something scrape against the wall outside. Another time, it sounded like a stick snapped just outside the window. I looked through the glass, but it was too dark to see anything. I told myself it was animals. Raccoons, maybe a deer. That's what I kept telling myself. The third day, I woke up to find muddy prints on the porch. Barefoot prints. Not animal tracks. Human. The prints started at the edge of the porch and went right up to the front door. They weren't there the night before, and it hadn't rained, so they were fresh. The mud was still a bit wet. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. I didn't know what to do. I didn't have cell service. The nearest town was an hour back down the road. If someone had come by, they didn't knock. They didn't leave a note. They just walked up to the door and left. I checked around the cabin. Nothing was missing. Nothing broken. But the prints were real. I ended up staying inside most of that day. I kept the fireplace going and the door locked. I even moved a chair in front of the door just in case. Every time I passed a window, I looked out. I didn't see anything, but the feeling of being watched never went away. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. Soft footsteps on the porch. I held my breath and sat up in bed. The steps were slow, careful. I heard the wood creak once, then silence. I didn't have a weapon, just a fire poker. I sat there in the dark for over an hour, waiting, listening. Nothing else happened. When the sun came up, I checked the porch again. More footprints, bare, muddy, and pointing toward the door. I decided I couldn't stay. I packed up as fast as I could. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the car didn't start. Clicked, then nothing. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood. I don't know much about engines, but one of the wires looked like it had been cut. Clean. I stood there for a long time, holding the hood up, just breathing. Someone had done that. Someone didn't want me leaving. I locked myself inside the cabin and pushed a dresser in front of the door. I turned off the generator and stayed in the dark. I didn't eat. I didn't drink much. I sat with my back against the wall and the fire poker in my hands. I waited for night. That night, I heard movement again. This time, it wasn't careful. It was faster. I heard something hit the side of the cabin, then a dragging sound, like something was being pulled along the wall. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. Around 4 a.m., it stopped. No more noise. No more sounds outside. I waited until sunrise, then looked through the window. I didn't see anything, but around back, near the shed, I found something that made my blood run cold. There was a pile of small animal bones. Rabbits, maybe birds, picked clean, arranged in a neat circle on the ground. In the center was a single feather, stuck upright in the dirt. I had no idea what it meant. I didn't want to know. I went back inside and didn't come out again. For 2 more days, I stayed there. I rationed my food. I tried to keep the fire low. Every night, there were sounds. Some close, some far. Once, I thought I saw a shape moving between the trees, but it was too quick. I was starting to lose track of time. My thoughts felt muddy, like I wasn't really awake. On the 5th morning, I heard an engine. I thought I was hallucinating at first, but it got closer. I looked out and saw a ranger's truck coming up the dirt road. I ran outside, waving my arms like a madman. He looked at me like I was crazy. I probably looked it. I told him everything. He checked around the cabin but didn't find anything. The prints were gone. The bones were gone. Even the wire in the engine looked untouched. He said maybe I imagined it. Stress? isolation, nerves. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. He towed my car back to town and I never looked back. I haven't gone into the woods since. I don't camp anymore. I don't hike. Sometimes I still hear those sounds when I close my eyes. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know they were real. I know they watched me, and I know they're still out there, somewhere waiting in the quiet. I'm not the kind of person who scares easily. I grew up working construction, lived in rough neighborhoods, and spent most of my free time outdoors, fishing, hunting, or hiking. But there's one thing that happened to me a few years ago that I still can't shake off, no matter how much I try to downplay it or make sense of it. It happened in the fall of 2021. I was 39 at the time and going through a rough patch. My girlfriend had left me. I'd quit my job over some nonsense with a supervisor, and I felt like the walls were closing in. A buddy of mine who owned a cabin in northern Minnesota offered to let me stay there for a couple weeks. Said it'd be good for me to get away and clear my head. The place was old, not fancy. No TV, no internet, no cell reception unless you climbed the hill behind it and stood near the edge of the woods. It was just a simple wooden cabin with a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a little fireplace in the main room. It sat near the edge of a frozen lake, with pine trees stretching for miles in every direction. I packed up my truck with some canned food, a cooler full of basics, a couple jugs of water, some tools, a flashlight, a .45 handgun, and some firewood. The drive took about 5 hours. Once I left the main roads, I was bouncing along dirt trails and barely visible logging paths. It was a pain, but when I finally got to the cabin and stepped out of the truck, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: silence.
Pure, thick silence.
Not even wind at that point, just stillness. It was already cold out, the kind of cold that bites into your jacket and makes your breath show even at noon. The first few days were normal. I chopped wood, walked along the edge of the lake, sat on the porch with a beer in hand and my feet on the railing. The cabin was old but sturdy. The wood creaked when I walked, and the wind sometimes found its way through the cracks in the windows, but otherwise it was solid. At night, I'd build a fire, heat up some soup, and read by lantern light. I didn't think much about anything. It was nice, but by the fourth night, something changed. That night, I was up later than usual, just staring at the fire. The wind had picked up, and the trees outside were rustling like they were brushing against each other. I remember looking at the clock. It was a little after 1 a.m. I turned in for the night, tucked into my sleeping bag on the old bed, and tried to sleep. Around 2:30, I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It was faint at first, but enough to pull me out of a deep sleep. I lay there, not moving, just listening. It sounded like footsteps, not close, but definitely outside. The crunch of dry leaves and twigs under boots. Then silence. Then another crunch. I sat up in bed and held my breath. I didn't panic. I figured maybe it was a deer or something, but the steps didn't move like an animal. They had rhythm. Heavy, slow, and deliberate. I got up quietly and walked over to the small window that looked out toward the lake. I couldn't see anything at first. It was pitch black out there. I had my flashlight, but I didn't want to shine it just yet. I pressed my ear to the window, and I swear I could hear breathing. Not close, but just close enough to be heard when the wind died down. I backed away, grabbed my gun, and stood near the fireplace. I waited, trying not to make any noise. Eventually, the sounds faded.
No footsteps.
No breathing. I didn't go back to sleep that night. I sat in a chair by the door until morning. The next day, I walked around the cabin looking for tracks. The ground was covered in dead leaves and frost. About 10 feet from the back of the cabin, I saw them.
Bootprints.
Big ones, not mine. They circled around the building and disappeared into the woods on the west side. I followed them for about 30 yards until they vanished in a patch of hard dirt and pine needles. There was no reason for someone to be out there. No neighbors for miles.
No trals. No campsites.
Nothing. I told myself it was probably some hunter who got turned around. I went about the day like usual, cut wood, heated up some food, kept the fire going. but I kept the gun closer that night. I didn't hear anything again. The forest was dead quiet. On the sixth night, it got worse. I went to bed around 11 o'clock. I had a fire going, and everything seemed normal. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was knocking. Slow, steady knocks on the side of the cabin. Not on the front door, but on the rear wall near the kitchen. I froze. I listened. The knocks came again 3 times. Then nothing. I got up, grabbed my flashlight and my gun, and moved toward the sound. I stood near the back window and waited. I didn't hear breathing this time, just silence. But the air felt different, heavy, charged. After 5 minutes or so, I slowly lifted the curtain and aimed the flashlight out. I saw nothing, just trees and dark. I opened the back door slowly, stepped out, and swept the beam side to side. That's when I saw something. On the far side of the yard, just before the woods began again, there was something hanging from a tree. I walked closer. It was a dead rabbit, freshly killed, its head twisted completely around and a bit of blood dripping from its mouth. It was tied up with twine or fishing line, looped over a branch about 6 feet off the ground. I cut it down, dropped it in a bag, and walked back to the cabin fast. That wasn't nature. That was human. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, I packed most of my things and kept them by the door. I still had 3 days left, but I told myself I'd leave the next morning if anything else happened. I hiked the hill behind the cabin and got 1 bar of reception, enough to send a quick text to my friend and say everything was fine, just to cover my bases. I didn't tell him what was going on. That day passed quietly. I didn't go far from the cabin. I stayed alert, walked the perimeter a few times, and kept checking for fresh tracks. Nothing new, but that night was the worst of all. I had just started dozing off when I heard the door handle jiggle. Not hard, not a full-on attempt to open it. Just a slow, subtle turn like someone was testing it quietly. I jumped up, heart pounding, gun in hand. I crept to the door and looked out the peephole. Nothing, just darkness. I didn't open it. Then the knocking came again, this time on the front door. 2 soft knocks, then silence, then 3 knocks, louder this time on the back wall, then on the side. It was like someone, or maybe more than one, was circling the cabin, knocking on different walls. Lightly, slowly, I backed into the middle of the room, heart racing, eyes darting. I aimed my flashlight out the front window. Just trees. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to run outside and get jumped. I didn't want to shoot blindly either. Then, after 5 minutes of silence, something slid under the door. A small piece of paper. I stared at it like it was a snake. I eventually picked it up. There were no words on it, just a drawing. A crude pencil sketch of the cabin. My cabin. And a small black X marked on the back wall, where the knocks had started. That was it. I didn't wait for morning. I threw everything into my bag, grabbed the firewood I had left, and loaded up my truck in 5 minutes flat. I didn't care about leaving trash behind or whether the fire was still burning. I just got in and drove. I didn't stop until I hit pavement, and even then I didn't stop for gas until I got near a town. When I got home, I told my friend what happened. He thought I was joking. A few weeks later, he drove up there himself and stayed for 2 nights. He called me afterward and said everything was fine. No tracks, no rabbits, no drawings, nothing. Maybe whoever it was knew I was alone. Maybe they knew he'd come armed. Or maybe they were done messing with the place. I don't know. All I know is something wasn't right out there. I still think about that piece of paper, that little drawing, the quiet knocking, the breathing in the woods. Now, I always trust my gut. I always keep a weapon nearby, and I never go back to that part of Minnesota. Not alone. Not again. That trip changed something in me. It made me realize that sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. Sometimes it's just people. People with bad intentions. People who don't say a word but let you know they're watching. And that's far worse. It was early October when I finally gave in and booked the cabin. I had been going through the kind of breakup that messes with your head. We had been together almost 5 years, and everything ended with one long silence over the phone. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating. I couldn't work properly. My chest felt tight all day, like something was sitting on me. I tried staying with friends, going to my parents' place, even distracting myself with movies or books, but nothing worked. I needed to be somewhere different, somewhere far away from all the noise. No people, no phone, no internet, no chance of seeing her face again on accident. I didn't want distractions. I didn't want company. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I just wanted to sit with my thoughts and let them burn out. So I looked up remote cabins. I didn't care about amenities or views. I just wanted something far out where nobody would bother me. I found the listing through a small rental website. It wasn't on Airbnb or any big platform. It was listed as Cabin 9B, backside of Olin Woods. I had never heard of Olin Woods before, and I couldn't even find it on Google Maps at first. I only found it after zooming in a lot on a topographic map someone had shared in a hiking forum. The place was real, just very isolated. The cabin was listed as a small single room built with a wood stove, a small kitchen, an outhouse, and a twin bed. No running water, no electricity, and barely a road leading to it. I had to fill out an old-looking form and email it back. The owner, some guy named Frank, sent me a code for the padlock and a basic set of instructions. Felt sketchy, but that's what I wanted. No frills, no people, no signals. I packed enough food and water for a week, brought my sleeping bag, a solar lantern, a hand crank flashlight, and 2 notebooks. My plan was to hike in, stay 6 nights, and just write everything I felt, every painful thought, until I ran out of things to say. The drive was long. I left from my apartment in the city early in the morning. After 4 hours on the highway, I turned onto smaller and smaller roads. By the time I got to the final stretch, the road turned to gravel, then dirt. The last bit wasn't even really a road. It was a narrow trail between thick trees. I had to park my car just off the main trail and hike the rest of the way in with my backpack and supplies. By the time I reached the cabin, it was almost sunset. The place looked exactly like the photos. Small, weathered, and sitting on uneven land. There was a stone fire ring out front and a small wooden bench beside the door. The roof sagged a bit in the middle. I looked around. The trees were dense, thick pines and bare birches. I couldn't see any houses or signs of people. Just forest, stretching out forever in every direction. I unlocked the padlock and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, old wood, ash, and a bit of mold. It was cold, darker inside than outside. There was a metal wood stove in the corner, an old cot, and some shelves stocked with a few pots and pans, candles, and matches. A table stood in the center with a cracked chair next to it. I sat down for a while without even unpacking, just breathed in the stillness. No traffic, no voices, no hum of electronics, just the wind against the trees. I lit a candle and unpacked my things slowly. I placed my food in a crate in the corner, filled a water jug from the containers I brought, and unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot. I wrote a bit that night, nothing too deep, just notes. I went to sleep early. That first night was quiet. I heard the wind, a few twigs snapping outside, maybe animals moving through the brush. It was colder than I expected, but I didn't mind. I curled deeper into my sleeping bag and slept. The next few days went mostly the same. I didn't speak. I didn't check my phone. I didn't do anything except write, cook simple meals, walk around the trees near the cabin, and sometimes just sit on the bench staring into the woods. I started sleeping better. I wrote page after page of thoughts. About the breakup, about my life, about the mistakes I made. Some of it was just ranting, some of it actually helped. But then things started to feel off. It was the 4th night, around 2 or 3 in the morning. I woke up to a noise outside. At first, I thought it was just wind again, but it sounded heavier, slower, like footsteps. I held my breath and listened. There it was again, a crunch, then another. It sounded like someone walking through the brush right outside the cabin. I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark. The fire in the wood stove had burned out, and I hadn't left a candle on. It was pitch black. I reached slowly for my flashlight and clicked it on, but the beam was weak. I had been cranking it earlier, but I guess not enough. The steps moved past the window toward the back of the cabin. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a bear, but it didn't sound like an animal. It was too deliberate, too spaced out. I sat there for hours, frozen, until the sky started turning light. When I finally opened the door and looked around, I didn't see anything. No tracks, no broken branches, just cold, damp ground. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was a dream. But that whole day, I felt on edge, like I was being watched. I couldn't explain it. I kept looking into the woods, expecting to see someone or something, but it was always just trees. That night, I barely slept. On the 5th day, I went further out than usual. I followed a narrow deer path up a ridge to get a better view of the area. I just wanted to clear my head, maybe convince myself that I was being paranoid. When I reached the top, I sat for a long time, looking out over the forest. It was beautiful, vast, quiet, but as I was getting ready to head back, I noticed something strange through the trees below. There was movement. I crouched low and watched. About 100 yards downhill, in a small clearing, I saw a shape. Person. They were wearing dark clothes and standing completely still, facing my direction. I stayed still. My first thought was that maybe it was another hiker, but there were no trails here, no campsites, no reason anyone else should be out here. They didn't move. They just stood there. I slowly backed away until I was out of sight, then made a wide loop back to the cabin. That night, I locked the door, even though it was just a flimsy bolt. I placed a chair in front of it, and I didn't light any candles. I sat in the dark with my flashlight and a knife from the kitchen drawer. Around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps again. This time, they came right up to the cabin. Crunch, pause, crunch. I held my breath. My heart was beating so loud I thought whoever was outside could hear it. The steps moved slowly around the cabin. I heard them stop near the back wall. Then nothing. I waited. Then I heard it, faint but clear. A tapping sound, like someone lightly tapping on the wood. Just once. Then again, a little louder. And then it stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. When the sun came up, I opened the door with the knife in hand and checked around. Still nothing. No tracks, no sign of anyone. Just trees. I wanted to leave. Every instinct in me told me to pack up and get out. But my car was a long hike away, and I was too shaken to go walking through the woods alone while someone might be out there. I decided to wait until morning. That day, I stayed inside. I kept the knife close. I tried to write but couldn't focus. I kept looking at the windows, waiting to see a face. But nothing happened all day. That night, everything escalated. It was about 11 p.m. I had just crawled into my sleeping bag when I heard it, the crunch of footsteps again. But this time there was more than one set. They were coming from different sides of the cabin. I turned off the lantern and froze. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The doorknob turned, slowly, then stopped, then again. A rattle, like someone was checking if it was locked. Then silence. I held the knife tight and pointed the flashlight at the door. I didn't turn it on. I just sat there in the dark. Then I heard the sound of something brushing against the cabin wall. And then a whisper, or what sounded like a whisper. It wasn't words, just soft, breathy sounds. Then it stopped. I stayed like that until dawn. When it was light enough, I grabbed my backpack, shoved everything I could into it, and left the rest. I didn't care about my notebooks or food. I just wanted to get back to my car. I hiked fast, taking the longer but safer route I had marked on the way in. I kept checking behind me. Every snap of a twig made me jump. When I finally reached my car, I felt like crying. I threw my bag in, started the engine, and drove without stopping until I hit pavement again. I never went back, never contacted the owner. I didn't leave a review. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. A few months later, I tried looking up the listing again. It was gone. The whole website was down. I checked forums, maps, tried to find anyone who knew about Olin Woods. There was It was the first week of October when I decided to take some time off work and rent a cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. I had been under a lot of pressure lately. Deadlines, meetings, and the constant buzz of emails wore me down to the point where I barely recognized myself in the mirror. My face looked older, like time had been dragging me faster than everyone else. I needed space, real silence, not the kind you get in your room with a fan running and cars passing by outside. I wanted to hear nothing. I wanted to hear wind, birds, maybe a stream if I was lucky. I found a small cabin online. It didn't have great photos, just a few blurry ones of a wooden structure surrounded by trees, but it was available for a week and it was cheap. The drive up was long and tiring. I left early in the morning, and by the time I got near the cabin, it was already close to sunset. The road that led to the cabin was just a thin dirt path that twisted and turned like a snake through thick pine woods. My tires kicked up dust that hung in the air behind me. There were no signs or lights, just trees on both sides and the crunch of gravel beneath the wheels. I drove slowly, trying not to damage the rental car. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked behind a line of thick trees. It looked older than the pictures made it seem. The wood was dark and weathered, and some of the planks near the bottom were warped. There was a small porch with 2 steps leading up, and the roof sagged a little in the middle. I parked the car on a patch of dirt beside the cabin and got out. The air was cooler up here, and it smelled like pine and damp leaves. Inside, the cabin was simple. 1 room with a bed, a small kitchen area, and a fireplace. The bed was against the back wall with a thin mattress, and a single window looked out at the trees. There was a wooden table near the kitchen and a metal sink with a pump handle. No electricity, no cell service. I turned on the old gas lantern I brought with me and placed it on the table. The soft yellow light filled the room and made the shadows move a little, like the cabin was breathing. That first night, I unpacked, made myself some food, and sat outside on the porch with a blanket. The silence was exactly what I needed. No sounds from other people, no traffic, nothing. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of something small moving through the underbrush. I went to bed early and slept better than I had in months. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. I followed a narrow trail behind the trees and walked for a few miles, just letting my mind wander. The trail led to a shallow stream that flowed over smooth stones. I sat by it for a long time, throwing pebbles into the water and watching the ripples. The forest here was dense and quiet, but not in an eerie way. It felt untouched. I didn't see another person or hear any machines, just birds, wind, and water. Back at the cabin, I cooked a small meal and wrote in a notebook I had brought with me. Just random thoughts, things I hadn't let myself think about in a long time. The quiet let them come out. That night, I sat by the fire with a cup of instant coffee and stared at the flames. There was something calming about watching fire move, like it had its own rhythm, its own logic. The third night was when things started to feel different. I had just put out the fire and was getting ready to sleep when I heard a sound outside. It was faint, like something stepping on dry leaves. I stood still in the dark room and waited. A few more slow steps, then silence. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. I didn't go outside to check. In the morning, I found small prints near the porch. They looked like boot prints, but the pattern was odd. The heel was deeper than the toe, like whoever made them was walking in a strange way. They led from the trees to the front of the cabin, then back again. I checked around but didn't see anything else. No broken branches, no trash, nothing. I shook it off. Maybe a hunter passed through. The forest was public land, after all. That evening, I kept the lantern lit longer than usual. I didn't feel scared, just alert. I listened carefully while eating and kept glancing at the window. The trees looked darker now, like they were pressing in closer to the cabin. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. This time it was louder. Leaves, twigs, and something heavier than a raccoon. I stood by the window and stared into the dark, but I couldn't see anything, just black trees and shadow. The next morning I found more prints. This time they were closer to the window, the same odd pattern. I followed them for a bit into the woods, but they faded out after about 20 feet. The ground there was covered in pine needles, which didn't hold tracks well. I turned around and walked back slowly, feeling watched. That day, I didn't leave the area around the cabin. I stayed close and tried to keep myself busy. I chopped some wood, organized my gear, and cleaned the inside of the cabin. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to feel uneasy. Not scared exactly, but unsettled. Like something was just slightly off. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up and listening. The woods were too quiet. No owls, no insects, no wind. Around 2 a.m., I heard something brush against the wall of the cabin. It was quick, like a hand dragging across the wood. I stayed in bed, frozen, listening. Nothing else happened. When the sun came up, I got dressed and stepped outside. The air was cold and still. I walked slowly around the cabin and saw something that made my stomach tighten. There were scratch marks on the back wall, low to the ground, for long scrapes in the wood. Not deep, but clear. I ran my fingers over them. Fresh. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe a bear, but it didn't sit right with me. Bears don't just walk up to cabins and gently scrape the wood. I started keeping a hatchet close by, even inside. I also blocked the inside of the door with a chair and a heavy box, just in case. That afternoon, I thought about leaving early. The plan was to stay 7 nights, but this was day 5, and I wasn't sure it was worth it. I tried to convince myself I was just overthinking things, that being alone out here was messing with my head. Still, I packed most of my things, just in case I decided to leave in the morning. That night, everything went quiet again. Dead quiet. Not even the wind. I sat by the fire, not really watching it. Just sitting, listening. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, and getting closer. I turned off the lantern and stayed low. The steps stopped just outside the front door. I held my breath, waiting. The door creaked slightly, not from being touched, but like the air shifted around it. Then nothing. Just silence. I waited there for what felt like an hour before crawling into bed and lying there with my eyes open until the sky outside turned gray. When morning came, I grabbed my things, loaded the car, and left. I didn't eat, didn't wash up. I just got in the car and drove. I didn't even look back. I made it back to town by late afternoon and got a hotel for the night. When I finally connected to the internet, I looked up the area. I didn't find anything specific. Just a few stories about people hearing things or feeling watched while camping nearby. It's been a few months since then, and I still think about it sometimes. I didn't see anything. No person, no animal. Just sounds, prints, and scratches. But that feeling of being watched, of not being alone out there, still sticks with me. I'm not sure what was out there, but I know I wasn't imagining it. I haven't gone back. I still love the woods, but now I choose campsites with people nearby. I still hike, but I carry more than just a hatchet now, and I never stay out past sundown. I went looking for silence, and I found something else hiding in it. Not a ghost or a monster, just something real, something that didn't want me there. I made it out. That's all that matters. It was mid-October when I decided to take some time off work and get away from the constant noise of the city. I'd been feeling burnout for months, my mind foggy, my body aching, and I just needed to reset. A friend had told me about a secluded cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana, near the base of the Cabinet Mountains. It wasn't listed on any major rental sites, but he had stayed there once during the winter and swore it was the most peaceful place he'd ever been. He gave me the contact info for the owner, and after a short call, I was all set. I planned to stay for 10 days completely alone. The drive up was already enough to make me feel like I was entering another world. The winding roads cut through thick woods, with towering pines on both sides. The further I drove, the less traffic there was. After 4 hours of remote roads, I finally reached the end of the dirt driveway leading to the cabin. It sat tucked into the forest, with no neighbors, no cell reception, and no sounds besides the rustle of wind and the occasional cry of a bird. I parked my SUV beside the porch and hauled my gear inside. The cabin itself was simple but sturdy. It had a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, 1 bedroom, and a covered porch that looked out onto the trees. The windows were old, with thick panes of glass and wooden latches. The owner had stocked the place with firewood and left a note about how to work the stove and pump the water from the well. I had brought canned food, dry goods, and some basic supplies, enough to last me more than 2 weeks if needed. The first 2 days were calm. I spent the mornings hiking the trails nearby and the afternoons reading or chopping firewood. The silence out there was something I had never truly experienced. No hum of traffic, no buzz of electricity, just pure quiet. It was refreshing but also a little eerie. By the third night, I noticed how dark it got out there. Even with the moon out, the trees blocked most of the light, and the shadows around the cabin seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. On the fourth day, I took a longer hike, venturing deeper into the forest than I had before. I followed an old trail that wasn't marked on my map, but it seemed to be well worn, like hunters or loggers used it at some point. After about 2 hours of walking, I found what looked like an abandoned logging camp. There were rusted tools, a collapsed shed, and some large empty drums half buried in the leaves. I poked around for a bit, took some photos with my camera, then started to head back. On the way, I noticed something strange. My footprints from earlier were gone. At first, I thought maybe I'd stepped differently or taken a slightly new path, but it unsettled me. I was sure I had followed that exact route. Back at the cabin that night, I felt a little on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't anything I could name, but the woods felt heavier, quieter, like they were holding their breath. I double-checked the door locks and loaded the old rifle the owner had left in the bedroom closet. I didn't think I'd need it, but it gave me some peace of mind. That night, I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m. The fire had gone out, and the cabin was freezing. I pulled on my jacket and got up to relight it. As I bent down to grab more firewood from the box near the stove, I heard a sound outside. It was faint, but it didn't belong. It was a rhythmic tapping like metal on wood. Tap, top, top. I froze in place and held my breath. Came again, a little louder. I walked to the window slowly and peeked out into the dark. There was nothing there. The trees stood still, their branches unmoving in the windless night. The porch was empty. I stood there for a while, staring, trying to make sense of it. Eventually, I chalked it up to a tree branch or maybe some wildlife. I got the fire going again and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin. Something in my gut told me not to wander far. Around noon, while I was splitting wood out back, I noticed something on a tree about 20 yards away. There were scratches on the bark. Deep, wide gouges, far too large for any animal I knew of in the area. I walked over and looked closer. The marks were fresh. The wood underneath was pale and damp, not yet dried from exposure. I took a few photos and stepped back. The next few nights, the tapping came back. It was never at the same time, never from the same place. Sometimes it was near the front porch, other times around the back. Once, I could have sworn it was coming from the roof. But whenever I got up to check, there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign of anything. On the 8th night, things escalated. I had just settled into bed when I heard a loud crash from outside. It sounded like something had fallen hard onto the ground just beyond the cabin. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the rifle, and threw on my boots. I went out the back door and circled the cabin with my flashlight. Near the woodpile, I saw it. One of the heavy logs had been thrown several feet from where it had been stacked. It wasn't just rolled or nudged, it was tossed. I scanned the trees with the light, heart pounding. I didn't see anything, but I felt watched. Every step I took back to the cabin felt like I was being followed. I locked the door behind me and stayed up the rest of the night, rifle in hand, staring at the windows. By morning, I was done. I started packing my gear. I didn't care that I had planned to stay longer. I didn't feel safe anymore. Something was out there, and I wasn't about to wait around and find out what. As I packed, I realized I hadn't checked the trail camera I had set up near the tree line on my second day. I had almost forgotten about it. I hiked out to retrieve it, hoping maybe it had caught something that would explain the noises. Back inside, I connected the camera to my laptop and started scrolling through the footage. Most of it was just empty woods, animals passing by, deer, raccoons, even a fox. But then, around 2:53 a.m. on the seventh night, the camera captured movement. A tall shape just barely visible at the edge of the frame. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a moose. It was a person, or at least it looked like one. No clothes, tall and thin, with a strange gait. It moved awkwardly, like its limbs didn't quite work right. It stood facing the cabin for a long time, then stepped back into the trees. That was enough for me. I grabbed my bags, loaded everything into the SUV, and drove away. I didn't stop until I was nearly to the highway. Even then, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't even ask for a refund. I didn't tell the owner what I saw. I just left it all behind. Weeks later, I finally showed my friend the footage. He watched it silently, then told me he had never actually stayed at the cabin. He'd only heard about it from someone else, a man who went missing years ago. I still have the trail cam video. I've shown it to a few people, but most say it's just a trick of the light or someone playing a prank. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt out there in those woods. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was something real, something watching, something waiting. I haven't camped or hiked alone since. Started with me just needing a break. I'd been working nonstop for months. Long shifts, no weekends, barely any sleep. I felt worn out. My head wasn't right, and my body was aching all the time. I told myself I needed to get away, somewhere far from noise and stress. So I rented a cabin deep in the northern woods of Michigan. It was late September, so the summer crowd was long gone. The trees were starting to turn red and gold, and the air had that clean, cold bite to it. The cabin was about 18 miles from the closest gas station, and that gas station didn't even have a working bathroom. There was a gravel road that led from the main highway into the woods, then a smaller, thinner path that wound deeper until it opened up into a small clearing. That's where the cabin was, wooden, a bit slanted and small, with a tin roof and a back deck that overlooked a shallow, quiet river. It was the kind of place that made you think nothing bad could ever happen there. But I was wrong about that. The first day went how I expected. I unpacked some food, got the little propane stove working, and lit the fireplace. There was no cell service, which was perfect. I needed to disconnect. I had a few paperback books with me and a thick sleeping bag. The windows didn't have curtains, but I didn't mind. No one was around for miles, or at least I thought that. That night, after cooking a simple meal and watching the fire burn down, I climbed into my sleeping bag and fell asleep fast. But around 2 a.m., I woke up. I didn't know why. The fire was out, and it was cold. Really cold. I sat up in the dark and listened. Nothing. No wind, no bugs, no animals. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I chalked it up to the cold and got up to stoke the fire again. I didn't notice anything strange at the time, but looking back, I remember feeling like something was just off. It was like the cabin wasn't empty. I brushed it off and went back to sleep. The second day, I decided to explore the area. There was an old hiking trail behind the cabin. It led uphill through the trees and eventually came out to a ridgeline where I could see miles of forest in every direction. It was beautiful. I stayed up there a while, ate a snack, then headed back down. When I got back, something wasn't right. The cabin door was open. I knew I'd closed it. I always check that kind of thing. Nothing looked stolen or broken, but the sleeping bag was moved, and one of my books was on the floor, open, even though I hadn't read that one yet. I stood there in the doorway for a long time, trying to figure out if an animal could have done it. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like someone had been inside, just looking around. I should have left then. I should have packed up and driven away. But I didn't. I told myself it was probably the wind, or maybe I forgot to lock it. I pushed the feeling down and stayed. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every little creak made me sit up. At one point, I thought I heard something moving outside the cabin. I waited and waited, but nothing came of it. Still, I barely slept. The third day, I went into town, if you could call it that. just a gas station and a couple rundown buildings. I filled up on gas and bought a few more canned foods. I asked the guy behind the counter if there were any locals still living in the woods this late in the year. He said no. Most of the cabins were abandoned until summer. That evening, back at the cabin, I kept the fire going and stayed up late. I had this weird pressure in my chest, like something was building. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Not loud, not fast, but steady, crunching through leaves. I grabbed the flashlight and looked out the front window. Nothing. I waited until I couldn't hear it anymore, then locked the door again. My heart was racing so bad I felt sick. I didn't sleep at all that night. The fourth day, I didn't go outside. I stayed close to the fireplace and kept my flashlight beside me even during the day. I kept feeling like I was being watched. Every time I looked at the tree line, I expected to see someone standing there. But there was never anything, just trees and wind. That night, I nailed the door shut with an old hammer I found under the kitchen counter. I dragged a heavy dresser in front of it too. I put all my food and gear in a bag in case I had to run. I kept the axe from the woodpile beside my sleeping bag. My hands were shaking the whole time. Around 3 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing. Slow, steady breathing, just on the other side of the wall. It moved from the front of the cabin along the wall to the back where the deck was. Then it stopped. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just sat there in the dark, holding the axe, listening. I don't know how long I sat there before I passed out from exhaustion. The fifth day, I made the decision to leave. I didn't care if I had to walk the whole way. I packed everything and left just after sunrise. The trees felt different that morning. Still quiet, but not peaceful. Like the woods were holding their breath. About half a mile from the cabin, I found tracks. Not animal prints, boot prints. Heavy ones. Deep enough to be from someone carrying weight. They followed the trail behind me. Then, after a while, they veered off and disappeared into the woods. I picked up the pace. I made it back to the gravel road in a couple hours, then followed it to the main road. A passing car picked me up about 5 miles down. The driver didn't ask questions. He just dropped me at the gas station. I never went back for my car. I called the rental company from a payphone and told them it broke down and I left it there. They didn't ask anything else. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep right. I kept seeing the trees out my window, hearing breathing that wasn't mine. Every sound made me jump. I started locking every door, every window. I bought cameras and motion lights. I still haven't watched all the footage they've recorded. I don't know who was out there with me. I don't know what they wanted. But I know I wasn't alone. Not even for a second. I've never gone back to the woods since. And I never will. I had planned to finish my novel in that cabin. I rented it for 6 weeks. It was deep in the woods of northern Montana, about an hour's drive from the nearest small town. I picked the place because I thought the isolation would help me focus. I had nothing but my laptop, notebooks, a solar battery pack, a satellite phone for emergencies, and enough food and water for the whole stay. That was the plan, no distractions, just writing. I arrived in late September. The leaves had just started turning gold and red. The air had that clean, cold smell that only comes with the changing seasons. The dirt road that led to the cabin was rough and uneven, and it took me nearly 20 minutes to get down it from the main road. I drove a second-hand SUV and was glad it had decent tires. The trees got thicker the deeper I went, pressing in from both sides until I felt like I was sliding into another world. The cabin itself was simple. It was made of old pine logs, small but well-built. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a small kitchen with a propane stove and fridge, and a main room with a desk and a fireplace. It had a front porch and a fire pit outside. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi, just me, the woods, and the silence. First, everything went as expected. I unpacked, set up my workspace, and started outlining chapters. The first few days were peaceful. I'd wake up with the sun, make breakfast, then write for hours. I took long walks in the woods in the afternoons. The quiet helped me think. No cars, no people, no emails. Just the wind in the trees, the distant call of birds, the crack of sticks under my boots. At night, I'd sit by the fireplace, read a little, then go to bed early. But then something changed around the end of the first week. Started small. One morning, I noticed a pile of rocks near the front porch. 5 flat stones stacked on top of each other. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe a curious animal knocked some stones together. Maybe it was already there and I hadn't noticed. But the next morning, the pile was gone. A different one had been made, this time on the backside of the cabin.
Taller.
7 stones, balanced too carefully to be natural. It gave me a weird feeling. I left it alone and went on with my day. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about the stone piles. My mind tried to explain them. Maybe a hiker had passed through and made them. Maybe a prank from some local kid. Though I hadn't seen another soul since I got there. The forest was thick and rough. This wasn't a place people wandered into by accident. The next day, I went on a longer walk than usual, hoping it would help me relax. I hiked out past the small creek that ran behind the property. About 2 hours in, I found an old fence. The wood was gray and weathered, some pieces broken and scattered. I followed it for a while and came across what looked like an old hunting shack. It was half collapsed, mostly rotten, but I saw boot prints in the dirt near the entrance. Fresh ones. The tread was clear, bigger than mine. That set off alarms in my head. I turned back immediately, hiking fast until I was back at the cabin. The whole time I felt like I was being watched. The kind of feeling that creeps into your spine, like cold water running down your back. When I got inside, I locked the door. I didn't usually lock it. That night, I kept the axe from the woodpile next to my bed. The next few days were tense. I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing noises at night. Branches snapping, footsteps in the dirt, the soft thud of something brushing the side of the cabin. One night, I heard a sound like breathing right outside my window. Slow and steady. I froze, didn't even turn on a light. Just sat in the dark, listening, holding the axe tight in both hands. After a long time, the sound stopped. In the morning, I found more stone piles. 2 this time, 1 on each side of the front door, taller than the others. 9 or 10 stones each. It felt like someone was marking the cabin, like they were sending a message. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't. Every noise made me flinch. Every shadow felt like it was moving. By the 4th week, I stopped walking in the woods. I stayed close to the cabin, always armed with the axe or the big hunting knife I kept in the kitchen drawer. I started hearing movement during the day too. Light crunching in the underbrush, like someone pacing just out of sight. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew they were there. I could feel them. I checked the satellite phone. Still worked. Could have called for help. I thought about it, but I kept telling myself it was just paranoia, that no one was out there, that I was imagining things. I told myself that until the 5th week when I found the trail camera. It was strapped to a tree behind the cabin. I only found it by accident. I'd gone out to relieve myself one early morning and spotted the black plastic casing half hidden by a branch. It was pointed right at my back door. I took it down and opened it up. There was a memory card inside. I had a small solar-powered laptop that I used for writing. I plugged the card in and opened the files. The photos were all time-stamped, dozens of them. The camera had taken shots every few minutes, triggered by motion. Most were empty, trees swaying, a bird flying past. But then I found one that made my skin crawl. It showed a man standing behind the cabin. He was tall, wearing dark clothes with a hood pulled over his head. I couldn't see his face. He was standing still, half turned toward the camera, like he knew it was there. The next photo showed him a few feet closer. The next, gone. I kept scrolling. More photos showed him on different days, always in different spots, always at night or early morning. He'd been watching me for days, maybe weeks, sometimes alone, sometimes with others. One image showed 3 figures standing at the tree line, barely visible. I felt sick. I should have called for help then. I should have packed my stuff and left. But something in me froze. It was like I didn't want to move, didn't want to do anything that might draw attention. I felt like an animal that knew it was being hunted. That night, I stayed awake by the fire, every light on in the cabin. I kept the axe by my side and the satellite phone within reach. I didn't sleep. I just listened. Hours passed. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I heard something. Not footsteps this time. It was metal scraping on wood. Slowly, like a knife being dragged along the wall outside. Then silence. Then the creak of the porch. I stood up, holding the axe tight, heart racing so hard I felt it in my throat. Then I saw the shadow pass in front of the window. Just a brief movement, but enough. I turned off all the lights, sat down behind the couch where they couldn't see me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe loud. I waited. After maybe 10 minutes, I heard the back door handle rattle. Softly, slowly. Someone was testing it. Then footsteps moving around the cabin. More rattling at the front door. Then nothing. I stayed hidden until the sun came up. When I stepped outside, the stone piles were gone. In their place was a dead squirrel nailed to the front door. His body had been cut open. I threw up in the bushes. I didn't waste time after that. I packed my things in under an hour. Laptop, notebooks, food, just the essentials. I kept the axe in hand. I locked the cabin, not that it mattered, and got in the SUV. The road out was harder than before. Recent rain had turned parts of it to mud. Branches had fallen in places where they hadn't been before. I had to stop twice to clear the path. Both times I felt eyes on me. I didn't look around. I didn't want to see them. When I finally hit the main road, I didn't stop driving. I made it to the nearest gas station just before sunset. I went inside, used their bathroom, and sat in the parking lot for a long time. Then I drove straight to a motel and stayed there for 3 days. I barely slept. I kept checking the locks, kept looking out the windows, jumped at every sound. I didn't go back to the cabin. I sent the owner a message and left the keys in the motel mailbox. I never explained why. A few weeks later, I tried to look up that area online. I searched for missing persons, crimes, anything strange. I found something buried in an old forum. A post from a hunter back in 2006. He said he'd found weird stone piles deep in those woods. Said he felt watched the whole time he camped there. One night, something had broken into his truck and taken a box of bullets but left everything else. He left the next morning. Never went back. Another post was from 2013. A woman who said her brother went missing near that same patch of woods. He'd been camping alone. They found his truck abandoned on the road. Cabin gear gone. No sign of him. I haven't written much since then. The book is unfinished. I still think about the cabin, about the man in the pictures, about the breathing outside the window, about the stone piles. I don't know who they were. I don't know what they wanted, but I know they were real. I saw them. I heard them. They were out there, watching, and they didn't want me. I needed a break from everything. From the noise, the people, the constant mess that came with living in a city that never really slept. I lived in a small apartment with thin walls and nosy neighbors. My job was demanding. My sleep was always shallow, and my patience had been hanging on by a thread for weeks. So, when my uncle offered me his old hunting cabin for a solo trip, I didn't think twice. It was in the middle of nowhere in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, tucked away in dense woods off a dirt road barely wide enough for one car. He hadn't been there in years, but said it was still standing, still had running water, and the generator might even still work. I packed up, took a week off, and made the drive. It was early September. Warm days, cool nights. The kind of weather where a hoodie was enough, but a fire still felt nice. I brought food, a cooler with ice, extra batteries, a flashlight, an old flip phone with better signal range than my smartphone, a hunting knife, and a small handgun my uncle insisted I take. I'd never shot it before, but he made me promise to bring it just in case. The drive took almost 11 hours. I only stopped for gas and a sandwich. The last part of the road turned into gravel, and then gravel turned into rough dirt, and eventually I was just following tire grooves through thick trees. Branches scraped the sides of my car, and I had to stop twice to move fallen branches. I remember thinking how quiet it was out there. Not peaceful quiet, heavy quiet. like the trees were holding their breath. The cabin was small, made of dark logs with a mossy roof and a creaky front step. There was a rusted metal fire pit out front, an old picnic table with a warped bench, and a shed about 20 feet away that leaned to the left like it was tired. The forest came right up to the edge of the clearing. No fence, no path, no neighbors. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and dry wood. The air was thick and still. There was one main room with a small bed, a cracked leather chair, a kitchen area with an old propane stove, and a table with two mismatched chairs. The bathroom was tiny, with a toilet that worked off a holding tank and a shower that trickled water from a pipe that groaned. The generator started on the third pull. The lights flickered but stayed on. That night, I made a canned chili, read a paperback I found in a drawer, and went to bed early. At first, everything felt exactly like I'd hoped it would. Quiet, slow, isolated. I woke up with sunlight coming through the windows instead of a buzzing alarm. I made instant coffee and eggs, sat on the front steps, and watched the trees move. No traffic, no emails, no one needing anything from me. I walked a little trail behind the cabin that led down to a dried-up creek. The ground was soft, covered in dead pine needles and fallen leaves. I found old beer cans, probably from my uncle's younger days, and some rusted wire fence half buried under the moss. That night, I sat by the fire pit, drank a beer, and let the dark settle in. It was so dark out there. No streetlights, no car headlights, nothing. Just black trees and stars. The third day is when things started to feel different. I had woken up early again, this time feeling like something had disturbed me in the night, but I couldn't remember what. The sheets were kicked off, and the back of my shirt was damp with sweat. I figured it was just the still air and maybe something I ate. I went outside and noticed boot prints in the soft dirt near the shed. They weren't mine. Mine had a wide heel and a distinct crack down the middle. These were rounder, cleaner, like a heavy work boot. I checked the shed, but the lock was still on. I told myself it was probably old prints I hadn't noticed. The ground out here held footprints for days. That afternoon, I walked farther into the woods, trying to get to a spot my uncle used to hunt from. I followed what was left of a deer trail for maybe an hour. I didn't see any deer, just old droppings and broken branches. I stopped when I saw something strange. A tree with a deep gouge taken out of the bark. It looked fresh. The wood underneath was pale and wet. Below it, the ground was torn up like something large had kicked at it. I saw more of those gouges on trees farther up. I looked around and didn't see anything, but I got that feeling, the kind you get when someone's standing behind you even if you know they aren't. I walked back quickly. I didn't run, but I kept checking over my shoulder. That night, I locked the cabin door, even though I hadn't the first 2 nights. I kept the porch light on. The generator hummed steady outside, but the woods were still so quiet. Not even crickets. I tried to read again, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept thinking about those boot prints and the tree gouges. I told myself it was animals, or some hunter passing through. Nothing unusual. 3 a.m., I woke up again. This time I heard something. It was a crunch. Leaves and twigs. Something walking. Slow, steady steps outside the cabin. I lay still, heart pounding, eyes wide. I had left the curtain open, and through the moonlight, I saw movement near the edge of the tree line. Just a shadow, but it was tall. Too tall to be a deer. It wasn't a bear either. It stood upright and didn't move for what felt like minutes. Then it turned and walked back into the trees. I sat up in bed, grabbed the gun from the nightstand, and waited. Nothing else came, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found more prints, deeper ones, leading around the cabin and back into the woods. I checked the shed again, lock still on, but the picnic table had been moved. I had pulled it out of the grass to sit in the sun the day before. Now it was facing the other direction, like someone had pushed it to get a better view of the cabin. I stayed close to the cabin all day. I kept the gun on me. I tried to act like it was fine, that I was just overthinking things, but I kept checking the trees. Every time the wind moved the branches, I jumped a little. I didn't make a fire that night. I didn't turn on any lights. I stayed in the dark and kept quiet. I figured maybe if someone was out there, they'd think I wasn't home. At 1:30 a.m., the generator cut off. I hadn't touched it. I kept it fueled. It was loud enough that I would have heard it sputter, but it just stopped. Dead silence. No hum, no birds, no breeze. I got up, gun in hand, and peered through the window. This time, he was closer. I saw a man, maybe 6 feet tall, standing in front of the shed. He had something in his hands. I couldn't make it out in the dark, but he stood there like he was inspecting it. Then he turned toward the cabin and started walking slowly. I backed away from the window and crouched near the door, gun pointed. My breathing was shallow, chest tight. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to make a sound. He walked up to the porch. I heard the step creak. I heard him stop. For minutes, nothing. Then I heard tapping. Slow, soft taps on the window, like he was testing the glass. I sat there on the floor until sunrise. When it got light enough, I opened the door, gun raised. No one was there, no sign of him, but the window had fingerprints on it. 5 of them, thick and dark, pressed into the glass. I packed up that morning, threw my stuff into the bags, tossed them into the car. I didn't eat, didn't even change clothes. I just left. The road felt longer this time. The trees felt like they were leaning in. I checked the mirror every few minutes. It took me almost 8 hours to get to the nearest town with a police station. I told them everything. I gave them the address, the timeline, showed them the prints on my phone. An officer wrote everything down, asked if I wanted to file a full report. I said yes. They sent a deputy to check the place out. I never heard what they found. I didn't ask. I never went back. The cabin's still there. My uncle offered it again later that year, said maybe we could go up together. I told him no. Told him to sell it or burn it or just let the forest take it. Sometimes I still dream about it. Not about the man exactly, but about the trees. How quiet they were. How they seemed to breathe when no one else could hear them. Sometimes, when I walk alone at night in the city, I catch a glimpse of someone at the end of the block. A tall figure standing too still. I never look twice. I never want to. I was never the kind of person who liked being far away from everything. I liked the sound of traffic in the distance, the buzz of streetlights, even the comfort of knowing someone lived right across the hall. But a few years ago, when everything got too loud inside my head, work stress, city noise, failed relationships, I thought it would be a good idea to get away for a while. I booked a small cabin in the northern woods of Minnesota. It was listed as an isolated spot, surrounded by forest, with a lake a short walk away. The photos showed a 1-room log cabin with a wood stove, a bed, a small kitchen, and not much else. It looked peaceful. That's what I wanted. Just peace and quiet. I packed enough food for a week, mostly dry goods and cans. I brought a small cooler with ice packs for meat and milk, knowing it wouldn't last long without electricity. I had a solar-powered battery bank for my phone, but I planned to use it only in case of emergency. The plan was to disconnect. Really disconnect. No internet, no calls, no texts. Just me, the trees, and the lake. The drive up took about 8 hours. The last 30 minutes were along a gravel road that kept getting narrower. Eventually, I turned onto an even smaller path barely wide enough for my car. It was filled with potholes and bumps that rattled every part of the vehicle. The sun was already low by the time I reached the cabin. The trees were tall and thick on both sides. The place felt tucked away from everything. The cabin looked just like in the pictures. It sat in a small clearing with trees looming around it. A narrow path led toward the lake, though I couldn't see the water from the cabin. I got out and just stood there for a while. It was dead quiet. No cars, no people, no distant hum of machines. Just wind in the trees and the sound of my own breathing. At first, that felt calming. I unpacked quickly and got the inside in order. The cabin had a gas stove and lanterns. I lit one of them and set it on the small wooden table in the center. There were 2 chairs, a bed with a thick mattress and wool blankets, and a small shelf filled with old paperbacks. I put my food in the cupboard and the cooler, then stepped outside for a minute. The air was cool and clean. I took a deep breath and looked up. The trees were dark silhouettes now, and stars were starting to appear. I stood there until I got a chill and went back in. I made some kin soup, ate slowly, then read one of the books until I got tired. I turned off the lantern, crawled into bed, and fell asleep. The first night passed without anything strange. I woke up once or twice from animal sounds outside, maybe a raccoon or something larger walking through the brush. But I didn't feel nervous. I reminded myself that I was alone and safe. It was just wildlife. It was part of being out here. The second day, I explored a little. I followed the path to the lake. It was beautiful and still, surrounded by trees. I sat on a rock near the edge for a while, skipping stones and watching ripples. I saw a deer drinking from the far side. I walked a bit along the shoreline, then turned back to the cabin. I felt more relaxed than I had in a long time. That afternoon, I chopped some wood for the stove. There was a small shed with an axe and a pile of logs. I made a good stack and set it near the door. I heated a can of chili, read for a bit more, and went to sleep early. Again, a peaceful night. Just the sound of wind and branches tapping on the window now and then. The third day is when things began to feel off. It was subtle at first. I woke up and noticed that the stack of firewood I made had shifted. Not much, just a few pieces that were leaning differently. I figured an animal knocked them or the wind moved them. But the logs were heavy, and the wind hadn't been strong. Still, I brushed it off. Later that morning, I went back to the lake and saw what looked like fresh footprints in the soft mud near the path. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and had a deeper imprint. They led toward the water, then turned around and disappeared into the trees. I paused and stared at them. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. The listing had said the nearest cabin was over 5 miles away. I stood there for a while, scanning the woods, but I didn't see or hear anything. Eventually, I told myself it could have been a hunter or someone passing through. It was public land after all. I went back to the cabin but kept checking over my shoulder. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, thinking I heard something outside. A branch breaking, footsteps in the brush. At one point, I was sure I heard something knock lightly on the wall. Just once. A single dull thud. I held my breath and waited. Nothing followed. When the sun finally came up, I got dressed and stepped outside. Everything looked normal, but the feeling in my stomach didn't go away. I walked around the cabin. I found another set of footprints, this time closer. Behind the cabin, by the shed. They were the same ones as yesterday. Big, deep, pointing straight at the back window. I felt a cold wash over me. I stayed out there for a while, listening, but the forest was quiet. I went back in and locked the door. The cabin had a bolt on the inside and a latch. I double-checked them both. I thought about leaving, driving back to the city, but I didn't want to overreact. Maybe someone was hiking nearby. Maybe they saw the cabin and got curious. I told myself I'd stay one more night. If anything else happened, I'd leave in the morning. I kept the axe by the door. I didn't go to the lake that day. I stayed inside, only stepping out briefly to grab more firewood. I kept the lantern lit even during the day. As night came, I boiled water for instant noodles, ate quickly, and tried to read again, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound outside made my heart jump. I went to bed fully dressed, with the lantern still on. The axe lay beside the bed. For a while, I just stared at the ceiling, then at the door. I didn't sleep much. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, crunching leaves, getting closer, then a soft knock on the wall. Not at the door, at the wall near the window, then silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I listened for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. I waited until light began to creep through the window. Then I got up, packed everything quickly, and left. The drive back along the gravel road felt longer. Every bump felt worse than before. When I got to the main road, I finally relaxed a little. I didn't report it. I didn't tell anyone right away. Part of me didn't want people to think I was imagining things, but I knew I wasn't. Someone had been near that cabin, watching, getting closer each night. A week later, I looked up the listing again. It had been taken down.
No explanation.
That trip was supposed to clear my mind. Instead, it left me more uneasy than I'd ever been. I never went back to a cabin in the woods again. I never will. I needed a break. I had been working nonstop for months. Long hours, short nights, and stress piling up more than I could handle. My back ached from sitting too long at my desk, and my eyes burned from staring at screens all day. I wanted silence, no buzzing phones, no honking cars outside the window, no crowds. Just trees, air, dirt, and maybe the sound of water if I was lucky. So I found a remote cabin for rent deep in the northern woods of Montana. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, no paved roads leading in. Just a rough trail barely wide enough for my truck and nothing around for at least 10 miles in any direction. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure, old but sturdy, surrounded by tall pines and thick brush, the kind of place you could sit and hear your own breath. I brought enough food and supplies for a week. I packed dry goods, cans, water, a small gas stove, basic tools, a hatchet, and a high-lumen flashlight. I also brought a GPS, a printed map of the area, and a shortwave radio just in case something went wrong. I wasn't going completely off the grid, I wasn't stupid, but I wanted to get close enough to feel like I had disappeared. The drive out took most of the day. Paved roads turned to gravel, gravel turned to dirt, and dirt turned into nothing but two ruts in the ground. The deeper I drove, the more the forest swallowed the sky. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, and the sky was gold behind the black silhouette of the trees. The cabin was just like the photos. A single-room wooden box with a small porch, a fire pit outside, and a narrow path leading down to a nearby stream. No locks on the door, no curtains on the windows, no insulation either. Just a roof, walls, and 4 wooden steps. I unloaded my truck and set up everything inside. There was an old cot with a thin mattress, a table made of rough wood, and a single shelf nailed to the wall. I put my supplies away and fired up the small stove to make myself some soup. After I ate, I sat outside and watched the sky change color until it was completely dark. I heard nothing but the crackling of leaves and the low rustle of wind in the trees. I went to bed early that first night. I laid on the cot with my sleeping bag zipped all the way up and listened to the forest. It was peaceful, real peace. No traffic, no buzz of city lights, just the slow creak of old wood and the occasional hoot of an owl. I fell asleep quickly. The next morning, I woke up early. I made some coffee, walked down to the stream to wash my face, and then explored the area a little. I brought my map and compass with me, marked the trail leading to the cabin, and walked about 2 miles north where the forest opened up into a wide meadow. I didn't see any animals, but found some deer tracks and what looked like bear scat. I wasn't worried. I'd spent time in the woods before. I knew how to be careful. The second day was uneventful. I spent most of it reading and chopping wood. That night, I made a fire outside and cooked some beans over the flame. Around midnight, I heard a snapping branch off in the trees, but it didn't sound close. Probably a deer or a raccoon. The woods are always full of sounds. I didn't think much of it, but the next day, things started to feel off. I woke up to find something strange near the porch. It looked like claw marks in the dirt. Not deep, but spaced wide apart. 3 gouges, uneven, with a small pile of disturbed soil at the end like something had raked the ground. I crouched down and looked closer. Not bear claws, no paw prints nearby, just these long, shallow scratches, and they weren't there the day before. I brushed it off, probably a branch or something dragged by the wind. I convinced myself it was nothing. Later that day, I went back out to explore further east. I followed the stream for about an hour, then cut back through the trees toward a higher ridge. From the top, I could see the tree canopy stretch out in every direction. No roads, no signs of people, just a sea of green. On my way back, I found something strange again. A pile of stones in a rough circle with a stick stabbed in the middle. At first, I thought it was a campsite marker, but the rocks weren't stacked like a fire ring. They were arranged too neatly, almost like a small fence around the stick. The stick was shaved at the top, like someone had stripped the bark off carefully. I looked around but didn't see any sign of other hikers. No trash, no footprints. Just this one weird structure sitting in a clearing. I left it alone. That night, I couldn't sleep as easily. I kept thinking about the rocks and the scratches. It didn't feel like animals anymore. It felt like someone else was out here. But who would be this deep in the woods without a vehicle or gear? I tried to calm myself down and stayed inside the cabin with the door closed tight. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a tapping sound. It wasn't loud, just soft tapping like something hitting the wall. Came in short bursts, 3 taps, then silence. Then again, always 3. I sat up in bed and held my breath. The tapping came from the far wall, the one facing the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the window. I turned the light on and shined it out. Nothing, just trees and darkness. The tapping stopped. I stayed up the rest of the night with the flashlight on. I didn't hear it again. When morning came, I went outside and walked around the cabin. No tracks, no signs of animals, nothing disturbed. I checked the walls. No damage, no dents. Just the same weather-worn wood. But something felt wrong. Couldn't shake it. I decided to take a break from hiking and stay close to the cabin that day. I chopped more wood, reinforced the door with some rope, and stacked heavy stones against it from the inside. I knew it wouldn't stop someone determined, but it made me feel better. I kept my axe close and even brought the hatchet into bed with me that night. That night, the tapping came back. This time, it was louder, and it moved. It started on the back wall, then shifted to the side, then to the front door. Always 3 taps, then silence, then 3 again. I stood in the dark with the axe in my hand, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't open the door. I didn't look outside. I just stood there, frozen, until it finally stopped. When daylight returned, I checked the outside again. And this time there were tracks, but they weren't normal. They were footprints, bare footprints, but they were wrong. The toes were too long. The heel print was too narrow, and the stride was off. One print was deep, the next one barely touched the ground, as if someone had walked half limping or dragging a leg. I counted at least 12 prints around the cabin, all in a slow circle, as if whoever it was had been walking around the cabin over and over. I packed my bag. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then leave first thing in the morning. I didn't want to drive at night. The trail out was narrow and full of dips, and I didn't trust myself to stay alert on those roads in the dark. But I regretted that choice. That night was the worst. The tapping started earlier, around 10 p.m., but this time it didn't stop after 3. Kept going. Slow, steady, deliberate. All sides of the cabin. Then scratching. Not like claws, but something scraping against the wood. I sat on the floor with my axe and flashlight, too scared to move. My heart thumped so loud I thought it would drown out the sound from outside. And then I heard breathing. I don't know how else to describe it. It was low, like someone trying not to be heard, right against the wall. I leaned in closer and could hear it clearly. Slow, steady breaths, like someone crouched against the cabin wall, waiting. I stayed that way until dawn. When the sun finally came up, the sound stopped. I bolted out the door, grabbed my bag, and ran to the truck. I didn't even look around. I just started the engine and drove. Fast. I didn't care about the ruts or the bumps. I just wanted out. About a mile down the trail, I had to stop. A tree had fallen across the road. It hadn't been there when I arrived. It was fresh, green leaves still on the branches. No storm, no wind, just one tree wide enough to block the truck completely. I got out and tried to move it. It was too heavy. I got the axe and started chopping the branches, clearing what I could. It took me over an hour to cut through enough to drive around the stump. All the while, I kept glancing back into the woods, sure I'd see someone or something watching me. I didn't, but I felt it. When I got back to town, I went straight to a small diner and sat there for 2 hours. Just sitting, drinking coffee, trying to feel normal again. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I called the ranger station the next day. I gave them the coordinates of the cabin and asked if anyone else had been reported in that area recently. They told me no. No hikers, no hunters, no campers. No permits issued for that region in months. I didn't tell them everything. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I didn't go back to that cabin. I didn't even go near the woods again for a long time. I still think about the footprints, about the tapping, about the way the breathing sounded right against the wall. I know it wasn't an animal, and I know it wasn't my imagination.